Sugar Apple Fairy Tale, Volume 1 Jinza Taoshi, Takuro no Yause. Chapter 1 The Scarecrow and the Fairy. The sun rises in front of her. A warm white light hit Anne's face, shining brightly. On the driver's seat, Anne held the reins. From the hem of her cotton dress she could feel the cold wind blowing. Even with clean lace covering the hem of her modest dress, she couldn't help but shiver slightly. As she took in a deep breath, she looked up at the sky. The rain from yesterday night seemed to shed some of the dust from the air. The autumn sky was clear. Today is the day for her departure. Clasping the reins with both hands, she looked ahead. The road was muddy. The wheels of the horse-driven carriage were piling up with mud. From now on she would be on her own, and she would be walking this road alone. Worry and nervousness spread throughout her thin body. But there is also a bit of hope that she feels in her chest. "Anne, wait, Anne." She heard a voice from behind. Behind the box-shaped carriage that Anne was riding, simple houses made of stone were strewn out. For the past half-year, Anne had been indebted to Knoxbury, a village located in the northwest part of the Highland Kingdom. Ever since Anne was born, she, together with her mother Emma, had lived by travelling. Therefore, Knoxbury village was the first that they stayed in the same place for 6 months. From that village, a tall golden-haired boy came over. He was the only son of a family who ran a candy crafting business in the village of Knoxbury. His name was Jonas. "Wah, this is bad." Ducking her head, Anne whipped the horse, allowing the carriage to start moving. She then waved back. "Jonas, thank you, please take care." "Wait a moment, Anne, wait, do you hate me?" "That's not it, so don't worry about it." Returning with a loud voice, Jonas yelled out, completely out of breath. Then, please wait." "Geez, I've already made up my mind, goodbye." The distance between the two quickly grew apart. When Jonas couldn't catch up, he paused. He looked towards her with a bewildered expression as he gasped for breath. Anne gave a big wave back again, before looking forward once more. "Watch over me, Mama." Earlier that spring, the healthy and merry Emma fell sick. And during that time, while staying at Knoxbury by chance, she became unable to move. The villagers were kind to Anne and Emma, who were strangers to them. They stayed at the village while trying to cure Emma of her disease, and the villagers gave them a recommendation to go to Jonas's house. The mother and daughter spent 6 months there without having to pay any rent. It might be due to the fact that they were in the same business that the family helped them out. However, Emma never healed. She passed away half a month ago. Find your own way of living and walk on that path firmly. If it's you, you can definitely do it. You're a good child, so don't cry. Those were Emma's final words. The funeral arrangements, such as the burial in the country's church, went on. While doing necessary tasks, the grief that surfaced quickly slid by. Although Anne did feel sorrow, she was never able to cry out loud. Emma is now sleeping in the corner of the Knoxbury cemetery, and while thinking that, somehow her hazy heart was able to appease her thoughts. When she'd finished all the tasks, half a month had passed since Emma had died. At that exact time, Anne decided to depart. 3 nights ago, Anne told the family she was indebted to that she will go out on a journey. "Anne, you can't go out on a journey alone. It's fine if you just stay in this village. And, that's right, why don't you become my bride?" Jonas whispered, grasping the hand of Anne, who was determined to go on a journey. Brushing up strands of soft golden hair with a smile, he looked at Anne with glimmering eyes. "You've always been in my mind." Anne and Jonas had spent 6 months living in the same house, but during that period they had never talked intimately. It didn't even cross her mind that the other party would possibly court her. Among Jonas's refined features, his blue eyes were exceptionally beautiful. It looked like an expensive glass imported from the south made for a king. So being stared at by those eyes, when they don't even know each other's likes and dislikes, puzzled her. It's not like being courted made her unhappy, but even then, Anne had already decided to go on her journey. She thought that if she informed Jonas of her departure, she might be held back from leaving, so she decided to secretly leave the village early in the morning. However, as expected, Jonas followed her. "Marriage." Absent-mindedly, she voiced it out. It was as if that word was completely unrelated to her. In the village, Jonas was popular with the ladies. Of course, one of the reasons why he is so popular was because he was from a wealthy candy shop. Even though he was living in a rural area like Knoxbury, Jonas came from a well-known faction of candy craftsmen and also a blood relative of the founder of the Ratcliffe Guild. It is a big possibility that he will be chosen as the next head of the Ratcliffe Guild. Before long, to prepare him for becoming the next head of the guild, Jonas would probably be going to the imperial city, Lewiston, for his apprenticeship. That was the rumor circulating around the village. Speaking about the head of a candy guild faction, if he's lucky, he can even become a viscount. Jonas, for the girls of the village, was already the equivalent of a prince. In comparison, Anne had a small build for a 15-year-old. Being gangly and having light wheat-coloured hair, she was always called Scarecrow. And incidentally, her only property was a single-tired horse and the old horse carriage. A wealthy blonde prince asking a poor Scarecrow to marry him, it's like a dream. Oh well, it's not like the prince seriously falls in love with the Scarecrow anyway. Anne muttered with a bitter smile as she whipped the horse. Jonas was by nature a playboy. He was especially kind to girls. The only reason that a person like him would be inclined to ask her for marriage would be because he felt pity for her due to her circumstances. She wouldn't want to get married out of sympathy. A happily ever after by marrying a prince, that kind of princess like fairy tale, doesn't seem to be a life worth living. It's not like she hated Jonas, but living a life with him didn't seem to have any charm. Experiencing everything by taking each step with her own 2 feet, that is the life she wants. Anne's father, having been caught up in the Civil War, died soon after she was born. But Emma, as a single woman, raised Anne and lived on. Furthermore, Emma became a silver sugar master, an admirable occupation. Candy craftsmen are common anywhere in the country of Highland, but only those recognized as silver sugar masters are the best, and in Highland only a few of them existed. Emma became a silver sugar master at the age of 20. The sugar candy made by a silver sugar master could be sold at a higher price compared to the candies made by an ordinary candy craftsman. However, in towns and villages of the countryside, these expensive sugar candies don't sell well. In the imperial city, Lewiston, there was a huge demand for these, but because famous silver sugar masters gathered there, it was a very difficult place to compete in. Emma chose to journey throughout the kingdom to find customers who needed sugar candies there. She liked the abysmally strong brightness that Emma possessed. The journey was harsh, but having earned it on your own, having walked on your own feet, made it enjoyable. If I can be a silver sugar master like Mama, then it would be wonderful. For so long that was what she idly thought. When Emma died, she finally decided on her future, and through the deep love and respect for her mother, determination bloomed inside Anne. I'll become a silver sugar master. But becoming a silver sugar master isn't an easy task. She knew that as well. Every year in Lewiston, the royal family hosted the Sugar Sculpture Festival. To become a silver sugar master, it is necessary to participate and win the top-ranking royal medal. Emma participated in the fair when she was 20 years old and was awarded the royal medal, and then she was given the right to call herself a silver sugar master. Silver sugar candy is a candy made from purifying silver sugar from sugar apples. Apart from silver sugar, there is nothing that cannot make sugar candies. There is nothing more beautiful than the workmanship of candies using silver candies. Sugar candies can be used for weddings, funerals, coronations, coming of age, and other various ceremonies. It is said that without sugar candies, all kinds of ceremonies wouldn't be able to begin. Silver sugar invites blessings and expels misfortune. It is often called the promise of sweet blessings, a holy food. Legends say that during the era when fairies still ruled over Highland, the fairy people consumed silver sugar to extend their lives. It was said that a mysterious energy, referred to as form, dwelled within beautiful sugar candies made from silver sugar. Humans eat silver sugar and sugar candies, but of course it doesn't extend their lives. But humans were also able to obtain the mysterious power that helps extend a fairy's life. In fact, when people have beautiful sugar candy and eat them, often unexpected luck pours in. Without a doubt, the probability of good fortune coming along increases. That is what humans realized after a period of hundreds of years experiencing it. It is because of that fact that the kingdom has strict regulations to qualify as a silver sugar master. The nobility were always trying to get their hands on the holiest and most beautiful sugar candies in order to gain a good fortune for them. It was even said that the fate of the country was determined based on the success of the sugar sculptures displayed at the autumn festival, an event carried out in order to pray for the peace of the country. Just like in previous years, when autumn is about to end, a fair will be held in Lewiston. And Anne planned on participating. Every year, only one person would be given the title of Silver Sugar Master. From what she heard, there are only 23 Silver Sugar Masters in the country since Emma died. It wasn't going to be easy. But she had confidence. She didn't help a Silver Sugar Master for 15 years for nothing. The cart proceeded down a road, with fields of wheat spreading out on both sides. By the time the sun was high in the sky, she'd arrived at the provincial capital of Riddington, the largest city in the vicinity of Knoxbury village. Riddington was a castle townel that radiated out around a circular plaza at its centre. Up on a hill overlooking Riddington was the castle of the Duke, who ruled Riddington province. As she proceeded slowly into the city, she came upon a crowd of people in front of her. The crowd was completely blocking the road. Anne shrugged her shoulders and got down from the driver's seat. She tapped lightly on the shoulder of a peasant woman whose back was turned toward her. Excuse me, what is everyone doing? The road is blocked and my cart can't pass through. No, you can go through, but, young lady, do you have the courage to cut through that tea? That tea. Anne ducked down as if to pass under the peasant woman's armpit and peered at the thing everyone was looking at. There was a brawny man standing in a puddle of mud. There was a bow strapped to his back and a longsword hanging at his waist. He was wearing leather boots and a fur vest. He was most likely a hunter. You useless little... Raising his voice, the hunter stomped on a clump of mud over and over again. Drops of mud went flying. Each time the clump of mud was stomped on, it let out a loud jaya. Looking closely, Anne could see that the clump of mud was the size of a human's palm, and human-shaped. It was lying face down and had a single, half-transparent wing sticking out of its back, repelling the mud. Is that a fairy? That's horrible. As Anne let out what sounded like a little shriek, the peasant woman nodded. Fairies were living creatures resembling humans who lived in the forests and fields. There were many types in all kinds of shapes and sizes, but the two half-transparent wings growing out of their backs were a special feature they all shared. Fairies had special abilities, so if you them right, there were all sorts of things you could get them to do. She'd heard that the royal family, aristocrats and knights, were using a large number of fairies for their own various purposes. Even among the populace, middle-class families often had at least one fairy helping them do household chores. Jonas's family in Knoxbury village also had a fairy named Kathy, who was about the size of a human's palm. Kathy helped with Jonas's personal care and with preparing the sugar sculptures. It's a labor fairy belonging to that fairy hunter. It stole its own wing and tried to run away. The peasant woman lowered her voice and pointed to the fairy hunter. In his hand, the fairy hunter was gripping a slender wing. It was likely the matching pair to the one on the back of the mud-drenched fairy. In order to control a fairy, the Master 3 would pluck off one of the fairy's wings and keep it with them at all times. A fairy's wings were the source of their life's energy. It was said that fairies could survive even if their wings were separated from their bodies. However, if their wings were damaged, they'd grow weak and die. Analogous to a human, a fairy's wings were like its heart. Anyone would quake in fear if their heart were held in the palm of someone else's hand. They'd become unable to oppose the person who held their heart. That's why, by plucking off one of the fairy's wings, the master was able to use the fairy as they wished. But of course no fairy wanted to be a slave. There were many who tried to distract their masters so that they could take back their wings and run away. Although people were whispering, even if he is a fairy, that treatment is too horrible, and that fairy is going to die, not one of them made a move to do anything about it. Anne looked up at the peasant woman next to her and the men nearby. Hold on, everyone. Is it really okay not to stop that guy's horrible behavior? But the people around her averted their eyes, seemingly unsure of themselves. The peasant woman whispered weakly, I feel bad for him, but fairy hunters have violent temperaments. We're afraid of retaliation, and besides it's only a fairy. So what if it's a fairy? If you sit around wringing your hands and doing nothing, that poor child will die. Fine then, I'll go. Anne brushed the peasant woman aside and took a step towards the fairy hunter. Hey, young lady, I'm telling you, a child like you should quit while you're ahead. I'm not a child, I'm 15 years old. In this country a girl is legally an adult at 15, right? I'm an upstanding adult. I'd be mortified my whole life if I, as a full-grown adult, just stood by and watched a fairy be pummeled to death. It's not a joke. Anne straightened her back and strode determinedly towards the fairy hunter. Perhaps because he was so worked up, the fairy hunter didn't notice Anne. With the fairy crushed under his boot, he gripped the wing he possessed in both hands. This is your wing, it means that you belong to me. Stop it, you bastard, stop. Given everything, the fairy still acted bravely, thrashing his tiny arm and legs and sending up splashes of mud. He shouted in a shrill, high-pitched voice. But the fairy hunter mercilessly stretched out the wing in his hands. The fairy in the mud let out a shriek. I'm going to kill you, you thieving fairy. Just as the fairy hunter put more force into his hands to tear the wing in half, Anne came to stand behind him. She lowered her hips and braced herself. Hey you, you're too rude. Together with her voice, the hem of her dress went flying up. Anne kicked out forcefully with one leg and connected with the backs of the fairy hunter's knees. It was Anne's special technique, the sudden death knee kick. The fairy hunter was caught completely off guard and his knees buckled. He lost his balance and fell face first onto the muddy road, his mouth open in an O of surprise. As the onlookers burst out laughing, the fairy leapt to his feet, freed from under the fairy hunter's boot. Anne leapt over the fairy hunter's head and nimbly snatched the wing out of his hand. You bitch, the fairy hunter yelled, raising his mud-covered face. Anne leapt lightly back and held out the wing she'd recovered to the fairy, who stood motionless in shock. Here, take it, this is yours, right? As if he'd finally come to his senses, the fairy snatched the wing. In his mud-streaked face, only his blue eyes shone with a strange light. The fairy looked up at Anne and said, Tay, I'm not going to thank a human. After spewing this out he took off, dodging around the legs of the onlookers, clutching the wing. Ignoring the people who let out yelps of surprise and moved to let him pass, the fairy made for the outskirts of the city with all the speed of a gale of wind, and soon disappeared from sight. Anne shrugged. Oh well, I guess I am one of those detestable humans after all. What are you going to do about this, little girl? How dare you let my important labor fairy get away? The fairy hunter shouted, standing up roughly with mud dripping from his chin. Anne turned back to the fairy hunter and said, But Oji-san, you were planning to kill that fairy, weren't you? If so, isn't that the same as him disappearing? What? The furious fairy hunter raised his arm. But the onlookers surrounding them raised their voices as one in protest. A big man like you, raising a hand against a child like that. It's as that girl says. You're too barbaric. Under the force of the onlookers' protests, the man shrunk back. Anne looked straight up at him unflinchingly. With a low groan, he lowered his raised arm. Thank you, it's a good thing you're such a good person, Oji-san. A good person like you will surely be kind to fairies from now on as well, right? That's great. Anne flashed him a sickly sweet grin, and the fairy hunter's expression twisted into an incomprehensible cross between smiling and furious. Lightly bidding the fairy hunter goodbye with a see you later, Anne made her way through the crowd of thunderously applauding onlookers and returned to the driver's seat of her cart. She muttered indignantly, I can't believe it, it's just too cruel, so what if he's a fairy? Fairies were, primarily in their appearance, a bit different from humans, yet they still possessed feelings and free will, and spoke the human language. And though that they were no different than humans, people whose conscience wasn't bothered by using fairies like slaves were the ones with something wrong with them. That's why Emma absolutely never used fairies either. We won't use fairies, that was Emma and Anne's creed, but... Anne's expression suddenly turned dark. But I too right now, am about to do something horrible. Anne lightly applied the whip to the horses and drove the cart forward again. When she came to the centre of town, she called out to a few children playing nearby and passed them some small change. Then she asked them to watch the cart for her for a short while. The children eagerly accepted. She got down from the cart and headed towards the circular plaza. In the plaza, there were tents lined up at irregular intervals. The tents were made of cloth painted with animal fat. They gave off a particular greasy stench. Groceries, cloth, copperware, and other goods were laid out underneath the tents. This was a marketplace. It was bustling with people. A sweet and sour scent tickled her nose, coming from the tent where one could drink heated wine. It was a famous product of this marketplace from fall through winter. Making her way through the marketplace, which was so congested that people were literally shoulder to shoulder, she came out to a place with fewer passers-by. This block was deserted. There were quite a few shops but extremely few customers. She cast her eyes at a nearby tent. A cage woven with ivy hung from the tent's crossbeam. There was a fairy the size of a human's palm inside the cage. On its back was a single, half-translucent wing. 5 or 6 of these cages were lined up in a row. The tiny fairy sitting inside of the cage was looking over at her with suspicious eyes. In the next tent there were 3 shaggy fairies the size of dogs. They were chained with collars around their necks. The single translucent wings on each of their backs hung limply, as if withered up. The shaggy fairies bared their teeth threateningly at Anne. This was the fairy market. Fairy hunters hunted fairies in the forests and fields and sold them to fairy merchants. The fairy merchants then plucked off one of the wings of the fairies who would become their merchandise, set an appropriate price, and sold them off at the fairy market. If she intended to head for the royal capital of Lewiston, passing through Riddington required going a bit out of the way. The reason she'd stopped here regardless of that fact was because she knew that the marketplace in this city contained an established fairy market. Approaching the nearest tent, Anne called out to the fairy merchant, "Excuse me, do you sell warrior fairies?" At this, the fairy merchant shook his head. "I don't deal in them, too dangerous those types." "Then, do you know of anyone in this marketplace who does handle them?" "There's only one place. The old man in that tent by the wall over there deals in them, but you should give up now, young lady. Not a good quality product, that one." "Oh really? Well, I'll just go and have a look, thank you." She thanked him and walked off. Fairy merchants classified and sold fairies according to their appearances and abilities. The majority of fairies were sold as labor fairies, to be used for manual labor. Those whose appearances were particularly beautiful or particularly exotic were sold as pet fairies, to be used ornamentally. And those who were particularly ferocious and could be used as guards or soldiers were sold as warrior fairies. Anne had come to the fairy market to buy a warrior fairy. From here, Anne would go to Lewiston to participate in the Sugar Sculpture Festival 5. The highway connecting the western part of the kingdom, where Knoxbury Village and Riddington were, to Lewiston, was called the Bloody Highway. It was a very dangerous highway. The highway traversed unsettled wilderness, and there were no rest stops or towns along the way. Because the area was very poor, there were brigades of people who'd gone broke and become bandits, and there were also many wild beasts. It was a highway that Emma had avoided crossing during her continuous journeys. There was a safe way to get to Lewiston by making a detour to the south and taking another highway. However, that route wouldn't get her to Lewiston in time for this year's Sugar Sculpture Festival. Anne wanted to make it time for this year's Sugar Sculpture Festival, no matter what. It was for an incredibly sentimental reason. Even she knew that. But without clinging to those sentimental reasons and constructing an objective before her eyes towards which to strive, she felt that she'd surely lose her footing. "This year for sure I will become a silver sugar master, I've decided." She raised her gaze determinedly. To traverse the bloody highway, she would need a guard. But unfortunately, reliable guards were nearly impossible to find. In that case, her only option was a warrior fairy. Fairies didn't disobey the person who held their wing. As guards, they were extremely reliable. Her desire to become a silver sugar master this year was huge. For that purpose, Anne would bend her conviction not to use fairies. When she reached the area she'd been told about, she came to a halt and looked around. In which of these tents were warrior fairies being sold? In the tent to her left, cages containing palm-sized fairies were strung up. These fairies were probably being sold as labor fairies. In the tent to her right, There were adorable little fairies the size of a grain of wheat inside of glass bottles sitting on a table. A fairy of that size probably wouldn't be of any use for manual labor, so they was likely a pet fairies. They were sold for children to play with as toys. There was another tent at the end of the alleyway straight ahead. The goods for sale in this tent consisted of a single fairy. There was a tanned leather rug laid out under the tent, and the fairy was sitting on top of it with one knee bent. There was a chain around its ankle, connected to an iron stake driven into the ground. The fairy's appearance was that of a young man, approximately 2 heads taller than Anne. He wore black boots and pants and a supple jacket. The matching set of clothing, all in black, was likely something the fairy merchant dressed him in to drive up the price. The fairy's appearance certainly stood out. He had black eyes and black hair, and there was a sharp atmosphere about him. His white skin, which looked as if it had never been exposed to the sun, was another special characteristic all fairies shared. On his back there was a single, half-transparent wing. It lay out on the rug looking just like a veil. The fairy's appearance was extremely beautiful. There was something about him that gave off a sense of quiet dignity. There was no doubt that this was a pet fairy. He seemed to be exactly the type that aristocratic ladies would be clamoring to buy at a high price as a decoration. Beneath the bangs that hung down over his forehead, his eyes were downcast. The languid light of the afternoon sun danced along his eyelashes. Just by looking at him, Anne experienced something pleasurable that sent shivers up her spine. How beautiful! As she gazed at him, drawn in by those long eyelashes, the fairy suddenly raised his face. Their eyes met. The fairy gazed directly at Anne. As if he were thinking something, the fairy briefly knit his brows. But then, seemingly having made up his mind, he muttered, "I thought you looked familiar, but now I've got it. You look just like a scarecrow." And just like that, apparently having lost all interest, he once again averted his gaze away from Anne. How rude, saying such things about a girl blossoming in the peak of her youth. At the fairy's utterance to himself, Anne's hands unconsciously clenched into fists. "There's not much going on there," the fairy shot back, still turned away from her. What a horrible thing to say. The person selling this rude fairy was an elderly fairy merchant. He was next to the tent, smoking a cigarette. When he saw Anne with her eyebrows drawn up in anger, the fairy merchant opened his mouth as if to say, "Not again." "Sorry, young lady. This product of mine has a foul mouth on him. He harasses all the humans who pass by, no matter who they are. Pay him no mind and continue on your way." "I do mind. It's really not any of my business, but you'll never be able to sell a pet fairy with such a foul mouth. Never. Why don't you give up on selling him and let him go already?" "He's not a pet fairy, he's a warrior fairy." Anne's eyes widened. It seemed that this was the tent she'd been told about, the one that sold warrior fairies. Still, she couldn't believe it. A warrior fairy? That can't be. No matter how you look at it, he's more fit to be sold as a pet fairy. I've seen warrior fairies before. They were huge and tough as rocks. This is also a warrior fairy. He's an excellent specimen. They say 3 fairy hunters died hunting him. With an openly doubtful expression, Anne crossed her arms. "The Oji-san I talked to earlier did say that you were selling a low-quality product. Aren't you just calling this foul-mouthed pet fairy a warrior fairy so that you can sell him? For fairy merchants, our reputation is everything. I wouldn't lie." Anne returned her gaze to the fairy. The fairy was looking at Anne again. He was smiling faintly, as if he found something funny. It was a fearless expression. He certainly didn't look like an obedient fairy. He had an air about him like he was up to something, but that still didn't mean that he looked strong enough to be useful as a warrior fairy. "I want a warrior fairy, but do you have any others besides him?" At her question, the fairy merchant shook his head. "Warrior fairies are tricky to handle. You can't deal with more than one at a time. He's the only one I have for sale. Just so you know, I'm the only one in this fairy market who sells warrior fairies. If you go to Libanpool, 60 Karen north of here, there's one other fairy merchant who sells warrior fairies." "If I have to make a detour to Libanpool, I won't make it in time for the Sugar Sculpture Festival," Anne moaned, chewing on her thumbnail. "Hey, Scarecrow." Suddenly the fairy opened his mouth. Anne glared at him. "By Scarecrow, do you happen to mean me? the lovely 15-year-old maiden before whom even flowers hide their faces in shame. Who else is there here besides you? Stop dilly-dallying and buy me. For a moment Anne was completely stunned. Buy me? Is that an order? The fairy merchant, after making a surprised face, clutched his belly and laughed heartily. This is great. This is the first time I've ever heard him tell anyone to buy him. Did you fall in love with this young lady at first sight or something? How about it, miss? You don't have any choice but to buy him, right? I'll give you a huge deal and let you have him for 100 crez. If not for that foul mouth of his, I'd sell him as a pet fairy. There would be people willing to spend 300 crez to buy him as a pet fairy. That would be if he didn't have such a foul mouth. But the amount of money the fairy merchant had suggested was indeed cheap. Warrior fairies and pet fairies were rare, and so they were expensive. 100 crez was equal to 1 gold coin. For a warrior fairy, it was an unprecedentedly low price. Hey you, if you're telling me to buy you, does that mean you have faith in your abilities as a warrior fairy? At this, the fairy looked up at Anne with a glint in his eyes. What do you want me to do? Guard duty. I will be travelling to Lewiston alone. I want you to protect me on the way there. The fairy smiled confidently. That's nothing. I'll even give you a kiss as a free bonus. I don't need such an overbearing bonus. Especially for my precious first kiss, it would be a shame to have it stolen away like that. Such a child. Well, excuse me for being a child. Of course she would have preferred a more serious and obedient warrior fairy if it were possible, but she didn't have time to make a detour all the way to Libenpool. Anne made her decision. It can't be helped, so he's got a foul mouth, so what? I can't afford to be picky. She took a hemp bag out of the pocket of her dress. She opened it and took out the only gold coin mixed in among the copper coins. Oh Shall&Ann, I'll buy this fairy. He, so you gave in after all, miss? The merchant flashed a gold tooth as he laughed. When Anne held out the gold coin, the fairy merchant examined it carefully and accepted it. Then he removed a small leather bag that had been hanging around his neck. All right then, let's confirm the wing. The fairy merchant opened the small leather bag and took out what looked like a transparent cloth folded up to around the size of a human's palm. Taking hold of the tip, he shook it once and the folded-up item flapped open. A wing about as long as Anne was tall appeared before her eyes. The half-transparent wing, which reflected rainbows of light according to the condition of the lighting, was so beautiful that she was hesitant to touch it. Although it had been folded up, there were no wrinkles or lines like a cloth would have. When she reached out her hand and tightly touched it, it felt like silk. The smoothness of it gave her the shivers. This is his wing. That's right, I'll prove it to you. As he said this, the fairy merchant grabbed the wing at the tip and somewhere in the middle and pulled, stretching it out. Immediately the fairy under the tent groaned. The fairy seemed to be bracing himself and his whole body stiffened. He was gritting his teeth. Stop, I get it already, so stop. At Anne's words, the fairy merchant loosened his grip on the wing. The fairy's body went limp and he braced one hand on the ground. When he raised his head, he glared balefully at the fairy merchant. The fairy merchant folded the wing up, returned it to the bag and handed the bag to Anne. Hang this around your neck and keep it on you at all times. No matter what you do, be careful. If this bag leaves your hands, there's no telling what the fairy will do to you. I had an acquaintance who was killed by his own warrior fairy after it took its wing back. Warrior fairies are ferocious. That's precisely why they're sold as warrior fairies. If they get their wing back, they aren't content to just run away. It's likely that they'll kill their master. But what should I do when I got to bed? Won't I be taken by surprise while I'm sleeping? When you go to bed, make sure to hide the wing inside your clothes and hold on to it while you sleep. With that I'll be okay. Just think about it. This person is holding your heart in the palm of their hands. Even if you succeeded in killing them, they might be able to crush your heart in the moments before dying. Fairies' wings are especially fragile, so they're frightened and can't act rashly. Having their wings damaged is a fear that appeals to a fairy's deepest instincts. You saw how much pain he was in just now, didn't you? Certainly, after seeing how he suffered, she could understand why fairies couldn't easily strike out at their masters. After actually feeling what it was like to use fear and pain to control another person, her depression about using a fairy only increased. Just be careful, especially of this one. Up until now, every time it looked like he might be bought, he started spewing out insults and nastiness that you'd never imagine he'd be capable of just from looking at his face, and in the end he scared away all the customers and remained unpurchased. And yet, this time he was the one who told you to buy him. I don't know if he's just that damn fickle or what, but whatever the case, this is a miracle. Is he really that troublesome? Are you going to change your mind about buying him after all? Anne though a minute but then shook her head. I don't have time to go to Liverpool, I'll buy him. In that case it's fine, be careful with that wing. Make sure he never gets the chance to take it from you. When Anne nodded, the fairy merchant set to work removing the chain around the fairy's ankle. The fairy gave a thin smile as sharp as a blade and whispered to the fairy merchant, "Just you wait, one day I'll come to kill you." "Oh, isn't that nice, I'll be looking forward to it." Lightly parrying the threatening farewell, the fairy merchant removed the chain. The fairy stood up. He was tall. His wing, shimmering with rainbow colors in the sunlight, extended to his knees. "So I guess I've purchased you, please treat me kindly." As she said this, the fairy smiled mockingly. "The state of your finances must be pretty good for you to have a gold coin, eh, Scarecrow?" "Don't call me Scarecrow, I'm Anne." Listening to this exchange between Anne and the fairy merchant made an uneasy face. "Miss, do you really think you can handle him?" "She can handle me, right, Scarecrow," the fairy in question answered. Being looked down at by a face that seemed to be making fun of her, Anne yelled once again, "It's Anne, Anne Halford. Next time you call me Scarecrow, I'm going to give you a big punch." "And I guess you'll be all right." Anne snorted and while glaring at the fairy replied vehemently to the fairy dealer's muttering, "Yes, I'll be fine, don't worry, Oji-san. All right, you come with me." "Say, what is your name?" Anne asked the fairy sitting beside her on the driver's seat of the cart as she applied the whip to the horses. The fairy crossed his legs long-sufferingly, crossed his arms and leaned back against the backrest of the driver's seat. You could say he was lounging. Between the fairy and Anne, who handled the horses fussily, the fairy seemed 100 times more in charge. The fairy glanced over at Anne as if it were a huge bother. "Why do you ask?" "Because I don't know what to call you, right? You can call me Tom or Sam, or another of those names that you humans are fond of." Generally, when using a fairy, the master would give it a name. But Anne didn't like this, because she felt it was humiliating not to be referred to using your real name. "If it were me, I'd want to be called by my real name. Aren't you the same? I don't want to just give you some random name and start calling you that, so tell me your name." "I don't care what you call me. Don't ask such stupid questions. Just give me whatever name you want and call me that." The fairy turned away. Anne peered at the side of his face and said, "Then I guess I'll call you Crow." As expected, the fairy looked at Anne with an extremely unpleasant expression, in exchange for being called Scarecrow. "That's right, Crow-san." The fairy knit his eyebrows. Then after a moment of silence he said reluctantly, "Shall&Ann." "That's your name." At her question he nodded. Anne smiled. "What a pretty name, much nicer than Crow. Which part of Shall&Ann is your name and which part is your family name?" "The whole thing is my name. There's no separation between personal and family names like in human names." "Oh really, but Shall&Ann is too long, so I'll just call you Shall, is that okay?" "I said you should call me however you like, didn't I? You are my master." "I guess that's true." Hearing it directly from the fairy's mouth once again, it wasn't something she was happy about. Her sense of guilt at having bought a fairy to use as a slave became even stronger. Under Anne's guidance, the cart pulled out of Riddington and proceeded towards the bloody highway. The fields of wheat ripe for the harvest disappeared, giving way on both sides of the road to sparse forest. Feeling that they were close to the bloody highway, Anne opened her mouth. "I bought you to serve as my bodyguard, but there's one thing I promise you. When we've crossed the bloody highway and arrived safely in Lewiston, I'll return your wing to you." Hearing this, Shall looked at Anne with distrust. "You're saying you'll free me?" "That's right." At this, Shall made a surprised face for a moment, but then immediately let out a stifled laugh from deep in his throat. "You're going to let a fairy that you spent a gold coin on go? Are there really such naive humans?" "Naive is a rude way to put it. I just think that fairies and humans can be friends. I don't like using a person that I might be able to become friends with. I bought you because I needed a reliable guard immediately and had no other options. But if I don't have to, I don't want to use fairies. Of course, selling you to some other human is also out of the question, so I'll return your wing to you. That's why, if possible, while we're journeying together, I'd like us to be like regular friends. Friends? There's no way we could be friends. Anne sighed at his cold words. That may be so, but this is just my and Mama's ideal. But with ideals, as with dreams, no matter how long you have them, if no one makes them into a reality, they'll always just be an ideal. So I'm going to make it a reality. I guess we'll see the proof of whether or not you're really that much of a scarecrow brain once we arrive in Lewiston. Didn't I tell you not to call me Scarecrow? The palm of her hand went flying towards him, but Shall lightly intercepted it. Anne chewed on her lower lip, vexed. Why did you tell me to buy you, if you think I'm such an idiot? If it were me, I'd definitely not want to be used by someone I think is a huge idiot. Humans are all the same. In that case, it's easier for me if my master is a blockhead. You just seem to be the biggest blockhead I've seen in the past few years. For some reason, when I talk to you, I always end up getting thoroughly depressed. Anne understood why Shall had gone unsold for so long. If he was this nasty about being her guard, how would he be when it came to actually protecting her? The wind ruffling the lace on the hem of her dress suddenly became colder. Anne noticed that a wild, rocky highway spread out before her. This was the bloody highway. The cart slowly entered the highway. The wheels rolled over the stones, and the tall cart swayed left and right with the vibration. The sky was clear, but the air was cold. The vicinity of the bloody highway was surrounded by high mountain ranges, and the wind blowing down from the mountains carried with it the cold of high places. The wasteland of dried grass extended as far as the eye could see. There were occasional, straggling trees, but it was obvious at first glance that the soil was depleted. Along the bloody highway, there weren't any towns or villages. However, the rulers of each of the territories the highway traversed maintained the part of the highway that passed through their own territory. Although the highway was maintained, that didn't mean that they captured the robbers or drove away wild beasts. There were only two things the territorial rulers did. First, they trimmed once a year so that plants wouldn't encroach on the highway. Second, they built simple fortresses called rest stops, where travelers could spend the night. The bloody highway was dangerous, but it functioned as a highway thanks to the territorial rulers performing these two services. Anne had detailed maps of the entire kingdom. Because they were indispensable for traveling, Emma had especially treasured these maps. She regularly updated the maps, writing in new information. Taking out the detailed map of the western part of the kingdom, Anne checked the location of the closest rest stop. As the sun began to sink, they hurried towards the rest stop, and they were able to make it by the time the sun had set. The rest stop was merely a square fortress with high stone walls. There was no roof. The gate was a drawbridge-type iron door operated using chains. The interior was overgrown with weeds and wide enough to easily fit 5 wagons. Basically, travelers could run inside the walls for protection from robbers and wild beasts. Anne drove the cart into the rest stop surrounded by trees. Then she closed the iron door. Anne was tired from being rattled all day by the cart for the first time in half a year. She decided to go to sleep early. She took out 2 tanned leather mats and 2 blankets that were stored under the driver's seat. Anne spread one set out next to the cart to use herself. Then she handed the other set to Shall. Choose for yourself where you want to sleep. Spread this out and use it to lay on. And this is for dinner. I'm sorry it's not much, but we can't afford luxury on the road. She then handed Shall a cup full of grape wine and an apple. Taking the rest of their journey into consideration, she decided to be thrifty with their dinner. Anne covered herself with the blanket, bit into the apple, and within moments she devoured it completely. Throwing the core far away, she gulped down the wine. The cold bitterness soon turned to warmth as it moved into her stomach. She curled up on the mat, feeling her ears heat up a bit. Shall spread out his mat a short distance away from Anne's, sat down and covered his lap with the blanket. Holding the cup of wine in one hand, he gazed up at the moon. There was a full moon tonight. The light of the moon illuminated Shall's face. Bathed in moonlight, the fairy's elegance was further polished. It was like a jewel, wet with dew and glimmering enchantingly. The wing on his back also shined a gentle, transparent light green color. It appeared that, unlike the one that was plucked off, the wing on Shah's back changed color and luminosity, subtly depending on his mood. Are the wings on fairies' backs warm, or are they cold? She was suddenly overwhelmed with the desire to touch it and see. Fairies' wings sure are beautiful. Is it okay for me to touch it? While asking, she reached out her hand. At this, Shell's wing trembled, rippled slightly, then beat upon the grass 2-3 times. As Anne snatched back her hand with a gasp, Shell glared at her with sharp eyes. Don't touch me. Aside from the wing in your hands, the rest is mine. In the face of this cold fury, Anne remembered that she possessed his wing, and that, to a fairy, their wings were as precious as their life. I'm sorry, that was thoughtless of me. She apologized sincerely, and while examining Shah's face in profile, gripped the string to the leather pouch that hung down the front of her chest. A fairy's wings were the source of their life force, like a heart was to a human. Using a fairy involved holding another person's heart in the palm of your hand, and threatening to crush it if they didn't do as you said. That was what Anne was doing. From a fairy's point of view, it must have seemed like the act of a demon. Anne sighed softly. I hate this. Perhaps she could get Shell to do as she asked without acting like that. If, for example, she were able to make friends with him, in that case there would be no need to use him. She would be able to ask him a favor and get him to agree to help her of his own free will. Hey Shell, I have a proposal for you. Anne lifted her head a bit. I said so this afternoon too, but why don't we try being friends? Are you an idiot? Answering brusquely 7, Shell turned his face away. Anne laid her head down on the blanket, depressed. It's probably no use right away, but I have the feeling that if I'm sincere towards him, someday he'll come to understand. At any rate, I wonder what he's thinking about while looking at the moon. His eyes are so beautiful. Her eyelids grew heavy, and Anne dozed off to sleep. In the comfortable darkness, Anne began to dream. As always, the setting was that of camping out. Anne was wrapped up in a blanket, and Emma was moving about busily, coming and going in and out of the cart. Seeing Emma right before her eyes, Anne felt a sense of relief. At the same time, something hot traced a line down her cheeks. There, Anne, what's wrong? Does it hurt somewhere? That's not it, I had a bad dream that you died, Mama. That's silly, having a dream like that means you're not feeling well. I'll check and see if you have a fever. Emma's cool hand softly touched Anne's neck. Those fingers were long and slender and always cool. That was because she cooled her fingertips in water when handling silver sugar, which melted easily. Those fingers were unbearably precious, and something about them seemed fleeting. Without thinking, Anne gripped the cool fingers. Mama, please don't go away. At the sound of her own voice shouting this, Anne awoke with a start. She realized that she'd been dreaming, but the cool fingers that Anne gripped were real. Shell's face was so close that she could feel his breath. His black hair seemed about to touch Anne's cheek. What? She pushed away the fingers she'd been gripping and leapt up. Don't tell me this is that high and mighty bonus he was talking about before. Shell smiled wryly and rose. That smile was chilly. It slowly dawned on her that Shell did not appear to have the proposed bonus on his mind. What on earth was Shell doing? Just now he was touching my neck. Just now you were touching my neck. That's when Anne noticed that the leather string hanging around her neck was sticking out from the collar of her dress. That leather string was the one from which the bag containing Shell's wing hung. Shell, don't tell me, you tried to steal your wing. I almost got it, he said with no trace of reluctance. You really did try to steal it, that's horrible. What is it? I said so, did I, that I wanted to be friends with you, and yet you. Anne really wanted to be friends with Shell, and yet she felt that those feelings had been betrayed, and that made her sad. Meeting Anne's eyes, Shell laughed mockingly. You want to be friends. You're holding the other person's life in the palm of your hand, and you say you want to be friends. At these words, Anne was taken aback. I was purchased by you, I'm being used by you, it's not possible for us to be friends. If Anne wanted to make her ideal into a reality, she would have to return his wing to him first, and then ask him to be her friend and beg for his help. That was the only way. But to be honest, she was afraid to return his wing. That's why Anne asked him to be her friend while holding his life in her hands. Even she knew that it was asking too much. There was no way he'd be friends with her, given their current relationship. As long as she possessed his wing, she was his master. Shall had merely done what was only natural for a fairy, and tried to take back his wing from his master. Thinking that she'd been betrayed, and getting sad and so on was barking up the wrong tree. The truth was that Anne was simply a foolish master for letting her guard down. I really am an idiot, huh? She sighed lightly. Anne had been doing nothing more than trying to make herself feel better by thinking it would be fine if we would be friends. She realized now how selfish and stupid she'd been. I have to go to Lewiston. I can't afford to take any dangerous chances such as returning your wing to you and then asking you to protect me until we get to Lewiston. That's why, even though I'd decided in my heart to use you, a part of me was soft. Saying that I wanted to be a friend was stupid of me. Anne closed her eyes and took a deep breath. Then she opened her eyes again. I said I would return your wing to you if you helped me to get to Lewiston safely. Did you try to steal your wing back because you can't believe me even if I give you my word? Or did you try to steal it back because being used by a human even for a short period of time is so hateful? Either way, it's fine. From now on, I won't let my guard down, so don't forget it. She looked up at the expressionless fairy. He didn't answer. While we're on the subject, I'll still keep my promise. When we reach Lewiston, I will give you back your wing. After that, I'll ask you again whether or not we can be friends. Until then, I am your master. Shall gave a derisive snort and turned his back to her. It seemed tragic that there was only one wing on his back, reflecting the light of the moon. Looking up at the night sky, he said to himself, the moon sure is beautiful. I screwed up. Even with his eyes turned towards the moon, Shall was aware of Anne's presence as she lay behind him. She radiated nervousness. The way things were now, even if she did fall back asleep, she'd probably wake up immediately as soon as she sensed his approach. It would be impossible to steal his wing tonight. But he wasn't in a hurry. Since falling into the hands of the fairy hunters, he'd been sold from human to human. Shall had spent all that time thinking only of killing his master and running away. But it wasn't that easy. These humans were cruel and wary. Since being put up for sale at the fairy market in Riddington, he'd worked hard to ensure he'd be bought by an idiot. If an idiot bought him, he could kill them, or perhaps he'd distract them and take back his wing, and then he could run away. However, the customers who came looking for a warrior fairy were all shrewd and cruel-looking. That's why, every time the customers would enter into negotiations with the fairy merchant, he did everything he could to act nasty and scare them off. I wonder what kind of customer will come today. I hope it's an idiot, while Shall leisurely sat wishing this. He'd suddenly sensed a sweet smell right under his nose. He felt it was similar to the scent of silver sugar. When he raised his eyes, a thin young girl with hair the color of an ear of wheat was staring over at him. She announced that she wanted to buy a warrior fairy. It was a 1 in a million chance. When Anne had decided to buy him, he'd smiled inwardly. She was a little girl, treating him like a friend, and constantly saying childish things like, "Let's be friends." He wouldn't even need to bloody his sword. He predicted that he'd soon be able to take his wing back easily. But Anne was more sensitive than he'd thought, and he'd been noticed. He tried to steal his wing. He was sure he'd be punished by having his wing hurt at the very least. But Anne hadn't punished him. On the contrary, she'd promised once again that she'd return his wing when they arrived in Lewiston, and she'd said that she'd ask him afterwards to be friends. It was mysterious. He didn't know what she was thinking, however. No matter what she's thinking, she's an idiot. With a girl this naive, there'd likely be hundreds of chances. There was no need to rush. He'd been being used by humans for almost 70 years. Whether he became free a day from now or 3 days from now, it didn't matter. Suddenly he again smelled that sweet scent. He glanced behind him. That scent was certainly coming from Anne's hair and her fingertips. It was the scent of silver sugar that stimulated his memories and agitated his senses. Shall unconsciously touched his fingers to his lips. It was a sweet sensation that he'd experienced in the distant past, the pleasure of having his wing tenderly stroked. Those gentle fingers. Remembering that sensation in the sinews of his back, he involuntarily let out a sigh. Liz. Behind him, Anne turned over in her sleep. Shaken to his senses by this, Shall took his fingers away from his lips. He glanced over his shoulder at Anne. She had her eyes closed. "Mama, please don't go away." Earlier Anne had shouted that as she opened her eyes. At this, he experienced a moment of doubt. What is her mother doing, letting a little girl like this travel all alone? The hand gripping Shah's fingers had been so terribly helpless. For some reason, that sensation remained distinctly in his heart. Chapter 2: Reunion on the Bloody Highway. There were no towns or villages along the Bloody Highway. In total, it was about 1,200 karen in length. Would they make it across safely? Anne stole a glance at Shell's face as he sat beside her on the driver's seat. It was a beautiful face. She'd never seen a warrior fairy with such an elegant appearance before. It made her uneasy. She wondered if Shall would really be useful as a warrior fairy. Since I already bought him, I have no choice but to believe in him, but... The Sugar Sculpture Festival was at the end of autumn, half a month from now. It would take 9 more days to finish crossing the Bloody Highway. After they arrived in the imperial capital of Lewiston, there would be 5 days left until the festival to prepare. It would be cutting it close. The next day they left as the sun was just coming up. They were still at the very beginning of the highway. The road was long and their time was limited. Anne wanted to gain as much distance as possible during the relative safety of daylight. From time to time she saw black figures that looked like a pack of wolves on a far-off rocky outcropping. However, the wolves made no move to come bearing down from the mountains. Up until just past noon, they progressed favorably along the highway. In just a few more hours it would be sunset. The plan was to arrive at the rest stop, where they would spend the second night with time to spare. Once they arrived there, they'd have travelled 200 karen since entering the highway. That would make their journey L6 complete. As they continued to plod along amongst the quiet and monotonous scenery, Anne suddenly heard the sound of a horse neighing. At the same time, the high-pitched sound of iron clashing together seemed to pierce through the air, reaching her ears. Startled, Anne tugged on the reins without thinking. As the cart slowly came to a stop, she gazed out into the distance. There was dust in the air on the road ahead of them. At the center of the cloud of dust was a brand-new box-shaped wagon. Since the back of the wagon was facing towards them, Anne couldn't see the figure on the driver's seat. She could, however, make out the sight of hands swinging swords on the other side of the wagon. There were 10 riders circling around the circumference of the wagon, making strange, gleeful noises. They wore varying outfits, but each had a cloth tied around his head, hiding his face. These were bandits who attacked travelers. "This is bad." Anne grew pale. When one laid eyes on bandits, the only course of action was to flee. She couldn't help the person who was being attacked right in front of her. The outcome was certain. Travelers were all aware that this was the rule, and would not begrudge each other for sticking to it. In this case, it would be wise for Anne to flee into a rest stop. However, the rest stop where they stayed the previous night was far behind them. She looked around on both sides of the road to see if there was any place to hide, but the area was a wasteland of tall grasses continuing on in all directions. There weren't any tall groves of trees. There was nowhere to hide the carriage. Just as she came to this conclusion, 2 of the riders from the ring of bandits stopped moving. Seemingly having spotted Anne's carriage, they turned their horses in her direction. "Oh no, they're coming over here." Letting out a cry, Anne gripped the sleeve of Shall, who sat next to her. That's when she finally remembered. "Are you? That's right, Shall. You're a warrior fairy, aren't you? Chase away the bandits." Shall looked at Anne wearily. "That's troublesome. If you don't, we're going to be killed, please." At this, Shall grabbed Anne's wrist and removed her hand from his sleeve. Conversely, he took Anne's arm and pulled her roughly towards him. "Shall what?" Shall leaned in with his face close to hers and whispered mockingly, "You're not supposed to be requesting but ordering, right?" Even in this kind of situation, her gaze was drawn to Shall's eyes, drilling into hers and his long eyelashes. Furthermore, his voice sounded as sweet as a lover's whisper. "Wah, too close, hold on, Shall, you're too close. Get back anyways, go already." Blood rushed to her cheeks. This was no time to be blushing, but she couldn't conceal her agitation. "Your face is red." Anyways, please." "This is amusing." Shall chuckled, making fun of her. This was undoubtedly hazing. Shall please go. I'm telling you to give me an order. An order, look, they're coming. Go immediately, I'll tear your wing. If you say that, I'll go right away. What are you talking about? Enough already, just go. She was stunned and not used to using a fairy. For that reason, the fact that she possessed his wing, which might as well have been his heart, flew right out of her head. Order it. She squeezed her eyes shut so that she couldn't see Shall's beautiful face. Then, go one, if you don't, I'll punch you. For the time being, she tried ordering him, using every bit of violence she could muster up. At her order, Shall shrugged his shoulders. I guess that'll do. I'll go as you wish, milady Scarecrow. Letting go of Anne's arm, Shall leapt lightly down from the carriage. Shall turned slowly and began to walk towards the riders that were coming barreling towards them. Gracefully extending his right arm out in front of his chest, Shall narrowed his eyes as if he were smiling. The single wing on his back trembled slightly. Then the drooping wing slowly flapped open. Parts of it shimmered with rainbow light reflecting the sun. At this, from all around him, shimmering particles of light gathered towards his open palm. As Anne watched, the particles of light condensed into a long, slender shape, forming a gleaming silver sword. A sword, he has an ability like that. In that case, Shall really is a warrior fairy. Suddenly, Shall broke into a run. Soundlessly, quieter than the wind, he ran, crouched low to the ground. Running up to the bandits, horses in the blink of an eye, Shall swung his sword at the legs of two of the horses. With that single swing, he cut the front legs off both horses simultaneously. The horses collapsed immediately, and the bandits were thrown to ground. Without even pausing to confirm this, Shall turned to run towards the remaining horsemen milling about. The other bandits noticed Shall's presence and turned towards him. In an instant their horses' legs were cut out from under them, one after another. Simultaneously, 5 horses collapsed. The bandits handling the remaining 3 horses let out angry cries and slashed out at Shall. With a downward swing of his sword, Shall cut the arm off of a bandit. The bandit's leader's face changed colors. Retreat, retreat. As the leader shouted, he turned his horse toward the foot of the mountains. The bandits who'd been thrown to the ground scrambled after him. The man whose arm had been cut off also, while moaning in pain, desperately set his horse to a run. The cloud of dust was briskly blown away by the wind. A silence fell on the scene of 7 struggling horses with their legs cut off, and the dead bodies of 3 bandits who'd been killed when they were thrown to the ground. Shall waved the sword lightly, shaking off the blood. Then, moving slowly, he thrust the sword into the necks of the struggling horses one by one, until finally they'd all stopped breathing. Anne's fingertips were cold, and she was trembling slightly. She averted her gaze in order not to see the horses Shall had finished off. Wounded that gravely, the horses couldn't be saved. Rather than letting them suffer unnecessarily, it was more compassionate to kill them. Although she knew that, she couldn't look directly at them. After all, Anne had been the one to tell Shall to save her. However, she hadn't thought that it would result in 7 horses and 3 people being killed in the blink of an eye. With just one word from her 3 people, bandits though they may have been, had died. She felt shock and fear that this had been the result of her order. So this is what they call a warrior fairy. While Anne remained for a long moment without moving, the driver got down from the driver's seat of the box-shaped wagon in front of her. Anne recognized who that driver was, and she couldn't believe her eyes. It can't be Jonas. At the sound of Anne's voice, Jonas, who was in a daze, watching Shall deliver the final blows to the horses, raised his head. Udace and. When Shall had finished off all of the horses, he lowered the sword in his hand. Just like when it had formed, the sword steadily turned into particles of light and dispersed. While doing her best not to look at the tragic scene of the dead bodies of the horses and bandits, Anne moved the cart forward, avoiding the corpses. When she pulled up even with Jonas's wagon, she stopped the horses. Anne got down from the driver's seat and ran up to Jonas. What's going on, Jonas? Anne, is he a fairy you're using? So you're the one who saved me. This must also be fate. In any case, I'm glad I was able to meet you. Since you left half a day before me, I thought you'd be far ahead by now. Seemingly excited, Jonas grabbed Anne's hands and gripped them with both of his own, as if enveloping her hands with his. I made a detour to Riddington, but that's not the point. Jonas, what are you doing in a place like this? I came after you. It would be dangerous to let you travel by yourself. That's why I persuaded my parents, readied a wagon and followed you. I'm going with you. Why? What do you mean, why? There can only be one reason, right? You should know how I feel about you. At his words, Anne was astounded. Aid. I love you, I want to go with you. Jonas, I'm really happy, but... Anne gently tugged her hands out of Jonas's grip. But I think you've greatly misunderstood your own feelings, Jonas. After all, no matter how you look at it, a person like you shouldn't be in love with a person like me. There's just no way. I think you've probably misunderstood your sympathy towards me for love. Anne was very ordinary looking, and she wasn't the type to act winsomely. Even by her own reckoning, she was in short supply of womanly charm. The truth was that although Jonas and Anne had spent the last 6 months together, their relationship had been more like that of mere acquaintances than that of friends. And yet Jonas had proposed to Anne, who'd always felt an ambiguous sense of distance between them. She couldn't think of any other reason, except that he felt sympathy towards her because of her mother's death. It was probably the case that Jonas felt excessively bad for her, to the point where the difference between compassion and love became cloudy, and misunderstood that he'd fallen head over heels in love with her. It's not sympathy, I love you, Anne. Say you're going to participate in the Silver Sugar Festival in Lewiston, right? That's what you said. In that case, I'll go too. I'll protect you and help you out so that you can become a silver sugar master. Hold on, just now you were attacked by bandits. You can't protect yourself, much less me, right? Besides, you're the precious heir to a sugar candy shop, and there's even the possibility you'll one day become the leader of the Ratcliffe Guild, right? I can't let a person like that come with me on a dangerous journey. What if you were injured? I wouldn't be able to face Mr. and Mrs. Anders, who were so kind to me. About the bandits, well, I let my guard down a little, but I'm a man after all, so it'll be okay. I don't understand how it will be okay at all. I'll be okay, really it'll be okay, and anyways I have a sword. Are you listening to anything I'm saying? Besides, Mother and Father both approved of me going to Lewiston with you. Mr. and Mrs. Anders agreed. That can't be, anyways you should head back. I can't turn back now. Heading back would be just as dangerous as going forward. In his enthusiasm, Jonas was inflamed like a person with a fever, too. There was no doubt that Jonas genuinely was mistaking sympathy for love. Nothing would give her more of a guilty conscience than letting Jonas get killed because of these mistaken feelings. You can't, you absolutely have to go back. Anne, don't say such cold things. Jonas laughed and gripped Anne's hand again. Anne was surprised and tried to pull her hand back, but he had a hold of it firmly. I came here for your sake. Do you hate me? Aren't you happy? Under his gaze, she was flustered. His gentle smile would have had the other girls in the village floating on air. It's not that I hate you, but how should I put it? That's not the problem. She leaned against the wagon, looking up at the sky, seemingly uninterested in interrupting their conversation. However, he suddenly knit his brows and pulled his back away from the wagon. Scarecrow, let's quickly leave this place. Wolves will come, drawn in by the scent of blood. Look up. Anne and Jonas looked up at the sky. The shadows of 3 black birds circled above their heads. Wild crows, they're the clean-up crew of the wilderness. When they appear, the wolves won't be far behind. Anne nodded quickly. She withdrew her hand from Jonas's, which had gone limp. I understand, we'll depart immediately. Jonas, please turn back now. No, I'm going with you. Jonas, if you die your parents will cry, and the girls of the village will cry even more. If you're gone, who will inherit the shop? You have a lot of things that are important to you, don't you? They are what you should be protecting. Anne put her whole heart into these words, but Jonas gazed unwaveringly back at her. Even if you say I shouldn't, I'm going. My parents have nothing to do with this. The shop doesn't matter to me right now either. All that matters to me at this moment is my feelings for you. Jonas had a warm home. He had a family and a shop that he would inherit in the future. He had so many important things right there in his hands. His was not an empty existence like Anne's, where there was not even one person who would cry if she died. He was a human who, unlike Anne, had no need to go up against such danger. Even so, he made no attempt to appreciate the value of what he had. Given this, Anne had just about run out of patience for Jonas's stubbornness. In any case, you aren't a person who should be acting so recklessly, Jonas. Anne turned her back to him and quickly climbed up onto the driver's seat. Shall was already seated on the driver's seat, glancing sideways at Anne as she applied the whip to the horses with an irritated expression on her face. Shall grinned mockingly. So there's really a man who would come chasing after you, not too bad for a child. I'm not a child, I'm 15 years old, an adult. Besides, Jonas and I aren't like that. He's just feeling sympathy towards me, though I still can't believe he put himself in such danger out of compassion. Even while saying this, Anne paid attention to what was happening behind them. Jonas had climbed up onto his own wagon and was slowly moving it forward, following after them. It seemed he really had no intention of returning to the village. In the first place, since he'd already come this far along the highway, it was as Jonas had said. It was just as dangerous to go back as to continue forward. What should I do? Anne whispered, and then said to Shall with a sigh, about the wagon behind us. For the time being, if something should happen, will you go to help him? Anne didn't hate Jonas. On the contrary, she was fond of his gentle smile and manner. Besides, she thought that someone who was so sympathetic towards others as to mistake those feelings for love must be a good person. It wasn't as if she could just abandon him. If you want me to do something, use my wing to order me. You were being noisy earlier too, saying order me. Why? I have no intention of doing things other than what I'm ordered to do. Basically, he was saying that he wouldn't do as she asked unless she threatened him to the extent of saying, if you don't obey this order, I'll take your life. To put it another way, it meant that he would obey only an order that extreme. He intended to obstinately disobey frivolous orders like, watch the horses for a minute, and hand me that blanket. To Anne, having to threaten to kill him in order to get him to hand her a blanket was troublesome. He was going to be a handful, she realized with a sigh. I resolved last night that I will use you. However, I do not wish to give you orders in such a fundamentally vile way, so this is a request. From now on as well I will start with a request, but if you say no, I'll change it to an order. As you wish, I'll say, if you don't want to have your wing Tom, do as I say. I'm prepared to do it if need be, but I will always start with a request. At these words, Shall stared fixedly at Anne. You really are a complete scarecrow brain. Shall, since earlier you've been using the chaotic situation to get away with calling me Scarecrow, but I'm fine with it now. Go ahead and call me Scarecrow, I don't care. Anne wondered what she should do if something happened to Jonas. Because thinking about it made her head hurt, she had no energy left to fend off Shall's name-calling. Anne stopped the wagon. As she did, Jonas pulled his wagon up next to hers and came to a stop as well. The two of them were looking up at the rest stop that Anne had chosen as the place they'd sleep on the second night of their journey. So this is a rest stop. Tonight will be my first time using one. This is your first time staying at a rest stop. Then what did you do last night? To be honest, until this afternoon I had a guard. There was a man on the outskirts of Knoxbury village doing crude labor. I hired him to be my guard. So last night I stopped the wagon by the side of the road and slept inside. He did protect me for one night, but it seems he saw where I hid the money inside the wagon. Before noon the next day he held me at sword point while he stole the money and ran away. Jonas related this tale relatively nonchalantly. Either he was brave or he was an airhead. Anne's shoulders slumped with disappointment. That's unfortunate, but didn't you let your guard down a bit too much? Yeah, you might be right, but all's well that ends well. At least I got away with my life, and thanks to that I was able to meet up with you, Anne. It seemed that he had no idea of the danger of travelling. If he was going to travel with her, she would have to instill that sense of urgency in him or there would be trouble. Jonas, stay here tonight and turn back tomorrow, okay? I'm just going where I want to go. It's not as if I'm following you or anything. But Jonas. Well, let's get going. Jonas winked and applied the whip to the horses. Anne clutched her forehead. My head hurts. They drove the two wagons into the rest stop and closed the iron gate. Once they were inside the rest stop, Jonas parked his wagon near the wall, as if holding back. Then he immediately disappeared into the back of the wagon. It seemed he intended to sleep in there. Not parking his wagon near Anne's seemed to be his way of insisting that he wasn't being clingy and following Anne around. Anne built a fire near the wagon. Then she put water, dried meat and vegetable scraps into a pot, making a simple soup. When it was done, she glanced over at Jonas's wagon. Autumn though it may have been, at night the temperature dropped. Anne didn't feel right about her, and Shall being the only ones eating a hot meal. Anne ladled some soup into a wooden bowl and approached Jonas's wagon. She knocked lightly on the double doors at the back of the wagon. "Jonas, it's me, open up." From inside there came some kind of rustling noise, and before long the doors opened. "Do you have some business here?" The person who opened the doors was a young, female fairy about the size of a human's palm. She clung to the handle, moving her single wing with all her might. The young, female fairy was Cassie, a labor fairy being used by the Anders family. Fleur hair was so red it looked like it was on fire. She further raised her standoffish, upturned nose and glared at Anne with large, upward-slanted eyes. "Cassie, you were able to come with Jonas." "In the first place, I am Jonas Zama's personal labor fairy. It's only to be expected." "Oh really, and where is Jonas?" "He is resting." "Then I'll just give you this soup to give to him. Would you tell him to eat it once he wakes up?" Looking at the bowl that Anne held out to her, Cassie sneered. "Something as crude as this, it won't likely suit Jonas Zama's tastes." It was exactly the attitude that servants working for nobles sometimes got, appropriating the mantle of their master's authority to look down on others. Anne knit her brows. That may be the case at home, but on the road even this is something to be grateful for. Cathy made an unpleasant face, but descended lightly to the floor and held out both hands. Fairies who'd had one wing plucked off couldn't fly. They also couldn't stay floating in midair, so Cathy had no choice but to descend to the ground to take the bowl. Anne crouched down and passed the bowl to her. For Cassie, the bowl was big enough to be a bathtub. Holding the bowl in her arms, Cathy wrinkled up her face. "It stinks like animal fat. Even a fairy like me wouldn't like this." "Oh really, soup, sorry for the imposition." Anne returned to the fire, fuming, and violently stirred the pot. Shall was sitting leisurely, staring into the flames. Taking a bowl in her hand, Anne ladled out Shah's portion of soup. Then she thrust the bowl out at him wordlessly. After gazing fixedly at the bowl in front of his eyes, Shall turned to Anne with a mysterious expression on his face. "This is, what do you want me to do with it?" Anne glared at Shall severely. "Do you think I'm giving this to you because I want you to say, Tilda, and feed me by hand? Obviously this is your serving, right? Was it wrong of me to give you something like this? Is this low-class soup that reeks of animal fat not suited to your tastes either?" At Anne's sudden outburst, Shall made a surprised face. "What is it all of a sudden? You practically have smoke coming out of your ears." "Because I'm just a scarecrow brain, they are highly flammable, right?" As if he'd become unable to repress it any longer, Shall laughed slightly. Then, with a gentle expression on his face, he stretched out his hand towards the proffered bowl. "That's some fire. I feel as if I could burst into flame. I was just told by a fairy that a crude soup like this isn't suited to the tastes of the high and mighty heir to a sugary candy shop. Is this crude soup not good enough for you either?" "It's not that there's anything wrong with the soup, I was just surprised." Shall accepted the soup and cupped the bowl with both hands. "Surprised at what? Perhaps at the fact that the soup looked incredibly bad or something." "I was surprised that you served me before serving yourself." "Why, it's only natural that the person serving will give soup to others before taking some for themselves, right? That's just good manners. Here's a spoon." Anne went to give Shall a spoon to scoop the soup with, but then she noticed that the soup in the bowl in his hands had already decreased by half. "Shall, you haven't drunk from the bowl, right? Could it be that there's a hole in it?" "I ate the soup." "You ate it, how?" "We don't eat with our mouths. We hold our hands over the food or touch it and absorb it that way." As she watched the bowl in Shall's hands, the surface of the soup rippled slightly, and it steadily decreased in volume. It appeared as if the soup were rapidly evaporating. "Can you taste it?" Anne asked unconsciously while staring fixedly at the scene before her. "No, even if we eat food, we don't perceive any flavor. All fairies are like that. In that case, no matter what you eat, you can't enjoy it, right? You don't taste any flavor from any foods at all. Just one, there's one food with a flavor we can perceive. What it is? Silver sugar, it's sweet. As if he'd suddenly remembered something, Shall cast his eyes downward. That expression was terribly lonely. It must have been a painful memory. Until being put up for sale in the marketplace, what kinds of things had this foul-mouthed fairy experienced? Just imagining it made her heart ache. He'd likely been bomb in nature and was living as he wished, when suddenly he found himself being chased down, captured and sold. What that must have felt like, Anne thought that if it were her, she'd probably seethe with resentment. Do you like silver sugar? Do you dislike it? I don't hate it. Then I'll make a sugar sculpture for you. I'm a novice sugar craftsman, you see. You are. Shall looked at Anne sideways, skeptically. Anne puffed out her chest slightly. Listen and be amazed. My mother was a silver sugar master, as her daughter. I've been playing with silver sugar in place of Play-Doh since I first started. Toddling, my skills are pretty impressive if I do say so myself. Perhaps I'll make a sculpture of grass in the moonlight that will suit you. Tasteless food couldn't be any fun. At that thought, Anne suddenly wanted to make a sugar sculpture for him. If Shall really was seething with resentment, perhaps the gentle sweetness of a sugar sculpture might be able to soften his heart a bit. Bewilderment flashed across Shall's face. Anne thought that troubled-looking expression of his was kind of cute. Smiling, Anne stood and circled around to the back of her own wagon, just as she stretched out her hands toward the double doors on the back of the wagon. Crash, the sound of something falling over inside the wagon rang out through the air, and the impact rocked the entire structure. Anne leapt back instantaneously and let out a shriek. Shall. Flying back to Shah's side, Anne grabbed his sleeve. There's something inside the wagon. Go look, please go look. At this, Shah glanced at Anne. Is that an order? An order? If I don't go and look, are you going to tear my wing? I wasn't thinking of anything like that, but... Then do it yourself. You. Since brutality such as threatening to tear his wing was unpleasant to her, Anne clearly couldn't order him. Shall, seeing through these thoughts of hers, was telling her to order him. From his mildly mocking expression, that much was apparent. He thoroughly intended to do as little as possible. She was a fool for thinking, even for a moment, that he was cute. Anne's temper flared up, but thanks to that anger her fear subsided. Fine, see if I don't go look. Anne hadn't been travelling all throughout the kingdom with her mother for the last 15 years for nothing. She had every intention of showing more nerve than just any 15-year-old miss. Taking up the fire-poking stick, Anne went to stand in front of the wagon doors. Anne held the fire-poking stick at the ready in one hand. Slowly she opened the doors. The inside of the wagon was quiet. The ceiling of the wagon was high enough that a person could walk around inside. On the walls on both sides, at a point near the ceiling, there were long, thin windows to let in light. Because the moon was bright tonight, moonlight came streaming in through these windows, illuminating the interior of the wagon with faint light. On top of the work table that was stationed along one wall, there was a stone slab upon which to knead sugar candies, a wooden spatula and a set of scales. Bottles of colour flakes 3, extracted from various plants, were lined up in a neat row. 5 barrels were lined up along the opposite wall. The interior of the wagon was the same as always. There's nothing here. Fearfully, Anne stuck her neck into the wagon and peered around. Just then, Hey, you! Together with the shrill voice, a small shadow hopped down from above the workstation. Kya. Letting out a shriek, Anne lashed out with the stick with all her might. It connected marvellously with the shadow that came flying straight at her. Given the force with which it was hit, the shadow went flying right out of the wagon and crashed into the back of Shall's head as he sat near the fire. After suddenly being attacked from behind, Shall turned around with the corners of his eyes drawn up in alarm. Shall grabbed the little shadow, which had fallen limply to the ground after the impact, by its collar and picked it up. Is this your idea of a joke? He shouted at Anne. She was also bewildered and shouted back angrily, I don't know what it is. It was in the back of the wagon. This was... Shall turned his gaze to the thing in his grasp, then he knit his brows. Let me go, you bastard. Just who do you think I am? The little shadow protested in a high-pitched voice. The creature who kicked and struggled while being held up by his collar was a blonde fairy in the shape of a cherubic young man. There was a single wing on his back. Strangely, another wing was wrapped around his neck like a scarf. Lemme go. So noisy. Shall let go suddenly. The little fairy fell to the ground, letting out a shriek. Tay, what a violent fellow. I'm delicate, you know, treat me more gently. He stood up, rubbing his behind. Anne approached timidly, then knelt and peered down at the fairy. The fairy looked up at Anne with wide blue eyes. Anne approached timidly, then knelt and peered down at the fairy. The fairy looked up at Anne with wide blue eyes. You were the one thrashing about inside the wagon, right? I wasn't thrashing around. I was taking a nap when this delicate me had a nightmare and bolted awake. I just bolted awake a little too high and crashed into the ceiling, that's all. Ah, you must have bolted up pretty high indeed. In any case, who are you? When and why did you get into my wagon? My name is Mithril Reed Pod 5. I've come to repay a favor to you. Repay a favor. Yesterday you saved me, so I've come to fulfill my obligation to you. Hearing this, Anne finally recognized him. Ah, it's you, the fairy who was being bullied by the fairy hunter in Riddington, that was you. At that time he'd been covered in mud, and she hadn't gotten a good look at his face. But if she remembered very, very carefully, that shrill voice of his sounded familiar. There was no doubt that the wing the fairy had wrapped around his neck was the one that Anne had taken back from the fairy hunter. That's right, I saw your wagon in Riddington and slipped inside. It was all in order to repay the favor to you. I was thinking that I could repay the favor right away, but I was exhausted from being worked to the bone by that idiot, you see. I accidentally fell asleep and slept until now. But thanks to that I'm as good as new. Starting right now, I'm going to marvelously repay the favor I owe you. But at that time, didn't you say that you'd never thank a human? That's what I said, but it's a fact that you saved my life. I don't want to become a compassionless creature like a human, so even though it's unpleasant, I'll repay the favor. I'll say this in advance, but even though I'm going to repay the favor, I'll die before I say thank you. Got it? He stabbed out with his tiny index finger towards Anne. Being pointed at so directly, Anne was bewildered. How should I put it? I didn't save you because I wanted you to be beholden to me or anything, so you don't need to repay the favor. Especially if it's unpleasant to you, and you'd rather die than say thank you, and so on. When you put it like that, I'm not sure whether you're grateful or not. You saved him, you're quite the bleeding heart, aren't you, Scarecrow? Shall said in disbelief. Well, it's not as if I could just watch him be killed, could I? You, Mithril, was it? I'm Mithril Reed Pod, don't shorten it. Sorry. In any case, Mithril Reed Pod, I don't need you to repay the favor. As if I'd let it go at that. Let me repay the favor. At his overblown haughtiness, Anne felt a sudden wave of exhaustion. Up until now I've not had much contact with fairies. I'd thought that they'd be sweeter and more gallant, but that's completely wrong, isn't it? Look at you, Shall. And Kathy, how did you all get so arrogant? Anyways, let me repay the favor. But there's really no need. No need, give me a break. Even if I have to follow you to hell and back, I will get you to let me repay the favor. What do you mean, follow me to hell? That's too scary. When you put it like that, I don't know if you're trying to repay a favor or get revenge. Why do I have to be threatened? In any case, let me repay the favor. I'm going to follow you around until I've repaid the favor. Fine, I get it. Then I'll ask you to do me a favor. Anne looked around at her surroundings searchingly, then suddenly snapped her fingers. That's right. In that case, to repay the favor to me, will you please apply some oil the axle of my wagon for me? Don't treat me like an idiot. You really intend to have me do something lame like that in exchange for saving my life? Think of a more impressive favor. An impressive favor, like what? To Anne, who was cradling her head in her hands, Shall asked with a chilly expression on his face, should I strangle him to death to make him be quiet? I'll do it if you order me to. Given how obscenely noisy Mithril was, it was impossible to tell from the tone of Shall's voice whether he was joking or serious. Hearing this, Mithril shrieked defensively, You bastard, what are you saying about a fellow fairy? HMPH, so you're an obsidian. You're just looking down on me because I'm a drop of water, right? Hey, human girl. It's Anne. Anne, this guy you're using, he's a fairy killer. Give him what he deserves in one decisive swipe, just like you did with that fairy hunter. But why are you giving me orders? Because it looks like he's going to strangle me to death. To Shall, who'd uncharacteristically made such a direct offer, Anne moaned, "Don't say such stupid things when I went to all that trouble to save him. In any case, since you are free, I'd like you to go wherever you like and live happily." You want me to go wherever I want? Are you trying to chase me away? I won't go. That's not what I meant, but somehow, I'm really tired, want to go to sleep already. This conversation with a shrieking Mithril seemed like it would continue on unresolved forever. Anne was completely worn out, so she turned her back to Mithril, got ready for bed, and then curled up with her blanket. Sorry, I'll make your sugar sculpture tomorrow night, as an apology. For making you wait, I'll make it extraordinarily beautiful. If you want to eat a sugar sculpture, don't try to steal your wing back just because I'm sleeping, okay? Regardless of whether or not Shall could be won over with a sugar sculpture, Anne felt that it was a bit shameful to use something like that to set up her defenses. However, it was a pressing issue. It couldn't be helped, since she would be in trouble if he took his wing back and disappeared. You won't need to worry about me taking it or not. I doubt we're going to be able to sleep at all anyways, Shall muttered gloomily. Hey, you guys, hey, don't go to sleep, don't go to sleep. At the sound of Mithril's voice, which seemed to stab straight into her ears, Anne covered her ears with both hands. I wonder if I couldn't have you do me the favor of letting me sleep tonight. Anne was coming to thoroughly regret her good deed. Hey, don't you go to sleep too. Aren't you supposed to be my comrade? If it's a noisy comrade like you, I don't need any. Fed up with Mithril Reed Pod, who was jumping about, Shall heaved a sigh of frustration and laid down. WHWHWH, what was that? What was that? You want to repay the favor. Are you an idiot? The other person is a human. Have you forgotten the pain of having your wing plucked off? Their wings were the most sensitive part of a fairy's body. The pain of having their wings plucked off was the same as if their arms and legs had been ripped off. Being forced to endure that pain was enough to make them hate those creatures known as humans. But Mithril snorted derisively. What are you saying, as if I could ever forget such pain? That's why I'll never thank a human, even if my life depends on it. But the person who took my wing was not Anne. Anne got my wing back for me. Whether human or fairy, bad people are bad, good people are good, so I will repay my debts to good people, so I will repay my debt to Anne too. Let me repay the favor. His way of thinking seemed to be somewhat warped, but in any case it was clear that he was grateful to Anne from the bottom of his heart. However, whatever else he may have been, Mithril was extremely loud. Shut up. Raising his hand, Shall swatted Mithril down as he jumped into the air. Mithril, who out a shriek as he fell, got back up, and with his eyebrows drawn up, began to bounce around Shall's head with even greater agitation. I'm opposed to violence, you fairy killer, you comrade killer. Fairies who'd had one of their wings plucked off became unable to fly. However, by beating their remaining wing and jumping with all their might, they could easily jump over a human's head. Making use of that jumping ability, Mithril leapt about, making an eyesore of himself. Seeing how it had only increased his boisterousness, Shall realized that it would be wiser not to make any further moves against Mithril. Anne, who lay curled up on her side covering her ears with her hands, knit her brows in apparent annoyance. It seemed Anne had saved this fairy, Mithril Reed Pod. She was such a naive girl, it astounded him. She was naive in her dealings with Shall as well. Anne had served soup to Shall before taking any for herself. Furthermore, she'd said she would make him a sugar sculpture. She was treating him as if he were a human. On top of that, Anne wouldn't give Shall orders. Her orders didn't surpass the level of requests. It was plain to see that Anne believed she was incapable of hurting his wing. Shall couldn't perceive any determination in her decision to use him. Being asked to do something was different from being ordered to do it. Which was why, honestly, he was bewildered. Should he obey her or should he ignore her? Shall was loath to obey when he hadn't even been ordered. However, Anne was in possession of his wing. If Anne felt into a predicament, the damage would extend to Shall's wing as well, which was a problem. Because he was unsure what to do, he'd chased away the bandits. He absolutely had not done it to obey Anne's order. She was too naive for him to obey. Why was Anne so naive? Perhaps it was because she was lonely. She'd been searching for her mother in her dream, right? There was no way she could not be lonely, travelling all alone. That's probably why she was kind even to fairies. She was likely unconsciously seeking someone to ease her own loneliness. Tonight Mithril was shrieking and raising a ruckus, and it didn't look like he'd get the chance to steal his wing from Anne. Well, I guess it doesn't matter. He wasn't really given any orders, so he didn't have to do much. All he had to do was watch Anne constantly getting flustered and laugh. She really was a naive girl. The sugar sculptures made by that scarecrow must surely be sweet. The thought suddenly popped into his head. Chapter 3. Attack. Seated next to Anne on the driver's seat was Shall, wearing a sleepy-looking face. Then, as if trying to wedge himself into the crack between Shall and Anne, lay my thrill curled up sleeping. Together with the break of day, the box-shaped wagon driven by Anne departed the rest stop. The night before, Mithril had continued shrieking all night long. As could be expected, both Anne and Shall had hardly slept at all. Anne had been soothing a shrieking Mithril as they departed that morning. Mithril shrewdly climbed onto the driver's seat. Anne and Shall, both suffering from a lack of sleep, were silent, and Mithril, perhaps tired from staying up all night, fell deep asleep, rocked pleasantly by the movement of the wagon. Looking down at a seemingly comfortable Mithril, Shall said hatefully, "Should I throw him out while he's sleeping?" "That's too excessive, don't do it. Besides, even if you throw him out, he'll come back, probably. He was saying he'd follow me to the depths of hell, remember? Until he repays the favor in a way he's satisfied with, we might never be able to get him to let us sleep. That is troublesome, but, now that you mention it, the matter with Jonas is troublesome too." Jonas followed along behind them with a matter-of-fact look on his face. After being rocked by the carriage for a short while, Anne checked the location of the sun. It was about time to take a break, which they'd used to eat lunch at the same time. A small, clear river flowing through the forest that ran alongside the road caught Anne's eye. Spotting an opening in the trees, she drove the wagon through it into the woods. Jonas also silently stopped his wagon. In order to store up water in the barrels lashed to the sides of her wagon, Anne began to arduously scoop water from the river with a bucket. Jonas watched her doing this for a while, and then seemed to notice that he also needed to stock up on water. JJ grabbed a bucket and headed towards the stream. Beside Anne, who leaned over the stream to scoop up water, Jonas likewise bent over. Noticing his presence, Anne turned her face towards Jonas. Jonas gazed back at Anne with an uncharacteristically serious expression on his face. Then he said to her hesitantly, "Anne, can't you understand? I was worried about you, that's all." Jonas put his hand into the stream and touched Anne's hand that was gripping the bucket. Anne was startled and reflexively yanked the bucket out of the stream. Even if he treated her like this, she was unsure how to respond and only ended up being troubled by it. However, he was in his own way kindly doing his best for her. "And," as he called her name, a light sigh leaked from Anne's mouth. Jonas was a good person. His reckless behavior was also for her sake. "We've already come 300 Karen since entering the bloody highway. That means we've already made it about L4 of the way across. At this point, it's more dangerous for you to turn back alone. In that case, it's safer for you to travel the rest of the way to Lewiston with us. Come with us." At this, a smile flashed across Jonas's face. "You do understand. In exchange, please understand this. Traveling is dangerous." "But aren't you using a warrior fairy, Anne? I don't think we'll be in any danger." "A warrior fairy isn't necessarily invincible. Don't rely on Shall too much and get careless." "I know that." Anne couldn't perceive any concern whatsoever in Jonas's expression as he said this. Jonas had probably hardly ever left Knoxbury Village. At most, he'd probably gone to Riddington occasionally to buy things and attend festivals. Perhaps it couldn't be helped that a person like him was ignorant about travelling. But he'd just been attacked by bandits yesterday. She wished he would act a bit more concerned. Shall had chased away the bandits yesterday incredibly easily. Perhaps that was why such a carefree thought like, "If there's a warrior fairy, we've got nothing to worry about," had taken root in Jonas's mind. After they finished scooping the water, they ate lunch and then departed once again. According to plan, they arrived safely at the rest stop, that Anne had chosen as the place they'd spend the third night of the journey. For dinner that evening, Anne invited Jonas to eat with them. As always, she built a small campfire, spreading out leather mats beside the fire, and called out to Shall, Jonas and Kathy. Mithril showed up by himself, even though she hadn't called for him. Then, as if observing, he walked slowly in a circle around them. I'll make introductions for Jonas and Kathy. This is Shall&Ann. He's a warrior fairy. I bought him in Reddington in order to have him be my guard. I've been calling him Shall. What about his name? Haven't you give him one? What I said just now is his name. At being introduced to a fairy, Jonas made a perplexed expression. Fairies were the same as tools. It was normal not to be introduced to them. Furthermore, it seemed he was completely unable to comprehend the concept of a master not naming their fairy. Kathy was looking at Shall curiously, but he had his gaze averted as if he didn't even see her. Jonas gazed at Shall fixedly once again. You're so pretty that it's a shame to make you a warrior fairy. You look like you, sell well as a pet fairy. At this, Shall answered icily, if you like me so much, why don't you buy me from this scarecrow? In terms of idiocy, you're evenly matched, so it doesn't make any difference to me which of you I'm used by. Anne got flustered and tried to shut him up, but there was no taking back the words that had already flown out of his mouth. Idiocy. There was no way he'd ever had an experience like being called an idiot by a fairy before. Jonas was more astounded than he was angry. Anne felt as if she herself had said something bad, and began to explain. I'm sorry, Jonas. Shall has a foul mouth, which seems to be why he couldn't be sold as a pet fairy. Even as a warrior fairy, because of his foul mouth he was sold off at a low price. Blockhead, idiot, and so on. I'm also being called all of these things, so don't take it to heart. You too, Shall, don't say such things to people other than me. Other people don't have an immunity to it. Yeah, well, you didn't do anything wrong, Anne, so don't worry about it. More importantly, what about that fairy over there? Regaining his wits, Jonas turned his gaze to Mithril. As his turn came up, Mithril entered the center of the circle without hesitation. My name is Mithril Reedpod Sama. Don't forget to put Sama on the end. Put Sama on the end. As if saying that he didn't understand what was being said to him, Jonas blinked his eyes several times in confusion. Shall and Mithril Reedpod, the two of you, why do you have to act like that? Say, Mithril Reedpod, how do you think people are going to feel being told, put Sama on the end of my name? Obviously they are not going to be happy to hear that. At Anne's chiding words, Mithril hung his head disheartened. Then he staggered off towards Anne's wagon. Jonas neglected to introduce Kathy, as if it were only natural not to. For dinner, Anne had water. Additionally, she layered dried meat between thinly cut slices of black bread to make sandwiches. She gave some to Shall as well. Glancing over at Mithril, Anne saw him sitting on top of the roof of the wagon with his knees purposefully drawn up to his chest, doodling absently with the tip of his finger. Mithril was extremely noisy, so since the night before she'd been thinking of him as a bother. However, if she thought carefully, his willingness to repay the favor was admirable. He was probably just putting up a front by coming out with a strange monologue like that because the person he was trying to repay a favor to was one of those hated humans. When he's not talking, he's really cute. His eyes are so big and round. Anne divided her own sandwich in half, then beckoned to Mithril. Come here, Mithril, this is for you. With a joyful expression appearing suddenly on his face, Mithril bounced towards Anne and snatched the sandwich from her hand. Then with a serious expression he said simply, My name is Mithril Reedpod, don't shorten it. That's right, sorry, Mithril Reedpod. Anne went to ration out a portion for Jonas as well, but he said that he had his own food and brought it out from his wagon. Jonas's food was unthinkably extravagant by Anne's standards. Grape wine, apple juice, pear jam sandwiched between slices of white bread, a slice of pie stuffed with meat. His mother had put her whole heart into packing a tremendous amount of food and had him take it with him. It was like some little master's picnic. Seeing this, Anne didn't have a hard time believing that Jonas's parents had consented to his going on a journey. Preparing such a detailed spread of food like this was an art that probably only the lady of the house would be capable of. There was no doubt that he'd been given the wagon and food supplies, and even the money to hire a guard by his parents, who'd prepared everything for him before he left. But why did the Anders family support their son's reckless behavior? Anne didn't understand it at all. If you had such a feast prepared for you, I guess you really didn't need my soup after all, Anne muttered without thinking. At this Kathy, who was pouring wine into Jonas's cup, said with a mocking laugh, "Of course not." Jonas glared at Kathy. "Shut up, Kathy, I won't allow you to speak to Anne so disrespectfully." Kathy's face suddenly went pale. As if trying to smooth things over, she said hesitantly, I'm sorry, Jonas-sama, I was just... Disappear." Kathy hung her head in shame. Starting from the tips of her toes and spreading upwards, her body lost colour and then turned transparent. Before long, her entire body had disappeared. It appeared as if the wine bottle that she was holding braced against her body was simply floating in midair. Fairies each had their own special abilities. It seemed Kathy's special ability was the ability to disappear. Jonas said apologetically, "Sorry, Anne, it appears that my labour fairy hasn't been taught to mind her manners properly. Your soup was delicious, really. It made me very happy." Perhaps Jonas's behaviour was only natural as a master. However, Anne felt bad for Kathy. Just before disappearing, Kathy's expression had been very sad. The next morning, the two wagons set out once again. Mithril sat happily in between Shall&Ann. He was in a good mood and chattering non-stop. "Anne, if there's something I can do to repay the favour, tell me without holding back. But don't make up some odd jobs or something. Let me repay the favour in a more outstanding way." "An outstanding favour? I'll try to think of something, but while we're at it, perhaps a favour that utilises your special abilities is best, Mithril Reed Pod. What kind of abilities do you have?" At her question, Mithril puffed out his chest as if he'd been waiting for her to ask. "My abilities, don't be shocked. Listen carefully. You see, I am the Great Lake in the northmost part of the kingdom of Highland, Lake Lois. That is, a drop of its water clinging to a leaf. I was bomb from that drop of water." "You were bomb from a drop of water? Are all fairies bomb from drops of water?" Anne tilted her head to the side. At this, Mithril waved his pointer finger at her chidingly. "Anne, you really don't know anything, do you? Fairies are bomb from all kinds of things. Blades of grass, pine cones, drops of water and morning dew, rocks and gems. Something's energy condenses and forms a fairy. However, for the energy to condense, a living creature's gaze is required. A human or a fairy or an animal or a bird, even a fish or a bug is fine. The energy will take form by being gazed at and become a fairy. A fairy's lifespan is about as long as that of the item that became the source of their birth. So if Mithril Reed Pod was bomb from a drop of water, what were you bomb from, Shall?" At this question, Shall merely glanced towards her and didn't respond. Instead, Mithril answered, "You can tell just by looking, this guy's an obsidian. Noble gem fairies 3 have the ability to create sharp items, because I was born from a drop of water. I have the ability to control water, that's my ability." "Control water, that's amazing, let me see." "Okay." Mithril held out both hands in front of his chest. He stared fixedly at his tiny palms, and water began to well up in the hollow between them. Mithril rolled that water into a ball, just as if he were kneading dough, then tossed it lightly into the air. It connected with the back of Anne's hand with a splash and burst open. It was just a bit, but Anne felt the coldness of the water. "Incredible, since you can control water, if there's a flash flood you can alter the course of the water, right?" "Don't say such scary things, as if I could do something like that." "Then what can you do?" "I just showed you, did I?" That's it." "That's right, what do you have a problem with that?" Depressed, Anne's shoulders slumped. It seemed that Mithril's ability was no big deal after all. At this, Shall said with heavy sarcasm, "That will come in handy if you want to give water to a little birdie." Shut up. What do you mean by that comment? Are you trying to make fun of me? I won't forgive your attitude. I'll say this in advance, but Shall, you should improve your attitude towards Anne too. It's too rude." "You're the rude one," Shall responded coldly. "What part of me is rude?" "The whole thing." "What did you say?" Glancing sideways at the two quarrelling fairies, Anne declared, "There's no need to fight. You're both equally rude." Anne earned a favourable amount of distance. If they were able to arrive that night at the rest stop that Anne had chosen as the place they'd sleep on the 4th day of the trip, they'd have progressed a total of 400 karen along the bloody highway. That was L3 of the bloody highway's total length of 1200 karen. The sun was slowly and steadily beginning to descend, dyeing the tips of the mountains with shimmering orange light. They'd probably be able to reach the rest stop without any problems tonight as well. Just as Anne was thinking this, harsh, slanting rays of light were slashing towards the wagon, as if pushing it forward, but suddenly they were blotted out. Shall looked up at the sky and knit his brows. My Thrill too looked up at the sky, as if drawn by an invisible thread, and then he went pale. Hey, Shall those are. Because Mithril was suddenly speaking in a gravely serious voice, Anne tilted her head. What is it? At the same time, Jonas's wagon, which had been following behind Anne's, picked up speed and his driver's seat drew up even with hers. Hey Anne, look up. From Jonas's frightened expression, Anne finally realized that something was wrong. She looked up at the sky where Jonas pointed. Anne was startled. The sky was pitch black. Since the light of the sun had been blocked out since earlier, she'd figured that clouds had come out. However, the things blocking out the light of the sun were not clouds. It was a flock of wild crows, as many as several hundred. The giant black birds had formed a flock, and without letting out a since cry were flying as if chasing after them. This is an attack. Anne had heard rumors of something like this. Wild crows were the clean-up crew of the wilderness, foraging for carrion. However, it was said that in the event that they couldn't find any dead animals to feed on, wild crows would form flocks to attack, kill, and devour living creatures. It was said that if you were attacked by one of these flocks, there was no hope for you. The crows would begin by targeting their prey's eyeballs with their sharp beaks. They'd inhibit their prey's movements and then begin to feast on their flesh. Even if they hid inside the wagon, it was no use. The crows were intelligent. They would patiently peck at the roof shingles until they'd opened a hole and then go rushing in. Anne shuddered, looking up at the flock of black birds covering the sky. If they were attacked by a flock of this size, there was no hope for them. They couldn't handle such numbers. Anne looked at Shall. This time for sure she would have to order him. Her life was also on the line. If you don't want your wing to be destroyed, save us from the wild crows. Now was the time for her to order him like that. However, Shall, please. Against her better judgment she began to speak, but at the word please, Shah's eyes lit up fleetingly. Anne felt him wordlessly rebuffing her. Are you trying to play at being friends again? Understanding his unspoken message, Anne resolved herself. Shall, this is an order, protect us from the wild crows. I'm holding your wing. You know what that means, right? Anne ordered, but she couldn't wipe away a feeling of uneasiness. She was thinking that she didn't want to do something horrible like pretending she would destroy Shall's wing. But if those thoughts were seen through by Shall, he probably wouldn't obey her order. Just as she thought, Shah's eyes narrowed as if he found something amusing. If he told her no, Anne didn't know what she would do. She might have no choice but to take his wing out from where it was concealed at her breast and act as if she intended to tear it. But Shah nodded, then, "Stop the wagon." Leaving her with only this instruction, he jumped down from the driver's seat. Anne frantically stopped the horses and looked back to where Shah had gotten off. Making the sword made of condensed light appear in his hand, he called nonchalantly back over his shoulder, "Hide in the wagon." "He's going to obey me, why?" The wild crows, seeing that they'd stopped, began to descend towards at them. And Jonas had also stopped his wagon, and was looking up at the sky with a face white with fear. "Jonas, you get inside the wagon too, hurry." At this, Jonas nearly tripped over himself fleeing into the wagon. "That's it, this is how I'll repay the favor. I'll also chase off those birds." Mithril abruptly snapped his fingers and stood up, rolling up his sleeves with sudden enthusiasm. Anne paled. No, it's impossible, you'll die, come on." "What do you mean, impossible? Don't be so ungracious towards my repayment of the favor. Whoa." Snatching up a grumbling Mithril by the collar, Anne jumped down from the driver's seat and flew into the back of the wagon. "Don't go out there. If you die repaying the favor, there will be no meaning to my having saved you in the first place." Sitting on the floor of the wagon, Anne hugged Mithril tightly to her. I'm going to repay the favor. While being embraced, Mithril's voice dwindled out, and his cheeks grew steadily redder. Finally he fell silent. Anne tilted her head, listening to the noises outside. The crows, who until now had been silent, began to caw loudly all at once, as if letting out a battle cry. Assailed by the sensation that that cry was suddenly coming crashing down upon her head, Anne unconsciously covered her ears with both hands. The noise and vibration of the wild crows, bodies incessantly hitting the wagon, assaulted her senses. It took all her strength to keep from screaming. "Help me, Shall." The wagon rocked as the horses shied in apparent terror. The wild crows' cries rained down all around them as if to engulf the wagon whole. Anne couldn't suppress the shaking of her body. She drew her knees up to her chest protectively and stayed as still as possible. At this, Mithril's tiny hand gently touched Anne's cheek. "Don't be afraid, Anne, it's okay. Shall is an obsidian, he's different from us. He won't get hurt and he won't break. Even among fairies he's exceptionally strong." After a considerable amount of time had passed, at last Anne got the feeling that the number of impacts from crows crashing into the wagon had lessened. The ear-splitting cries of the crows lessened as well, until bit by bit, all became quiet outside the wagon. Complete silence had returned. Anne and Mithril looked at each other. "I wonder if it's over." "Yes, I don't know." Anne raised her head, set Mithril on the floor and stood up. Fearfully she opened the door. Just at that moment, something black dropped to the ground with a thud, right before her eyes. "What is—" Anne leapt back, falling on her rear. What had slid down off the roof of the wagon and landed on the steps was the dead body of a wild crow. After confirming this, Anne returned her eyes to the scene before her. What she saw on the other side of the open door was a highway paved pitch black. The highway was covered with the dead bodies of crows, appearing as if it had been spread with black feathers. Shall stood still on top of that pitch black carpet, his white cheeks splattered with blood. "Is Shall—" At her call, he turned his gaze towards Anne. His eyes were sharp, as if simultaneously repulsed and spellbound by the scene around him. At this moment, he truly appeared to be a sword chiseled out of polished obsidian. Swinging the sword in his hand, Shall let it dissipate, then wiped nonchalantly at the blood on his cheek. Then he slowly made his way across the black carpet towards Anne. At the sight of Anne collapsed in a pile, Shall laughed brusquely, as if making fun of her. "Did your legs give out on you?" No." Anne tried to stand up and refute him firmly, but her legs couldn't hold her and she staggered. Just when it appeared that Anne was in danger of tumbling out of the wagon, Shall caught her in his arms. At just that moment, Shah's wing, fluttering in the wind, brushed across Anne's cheek. At that sensation, smoother than the most luxurious silk, something sweet ran up her back with a jolt. When Anne looked up, black eyes were looking down at her. Unthinkingly, she gazed back in fascination. That blackness threatened to suck her in. How beautiful, she thought once again. The eyes gazing at her were so lustrous it seemed as if her entire body would melt. "What is it, Scarecrow? Do you want a bonus?" Having the mocking question whispered to her in such a sweet voice, Anne suddenly became angry. "Who would?" She frantically removed herself from Shah's grip, then turned her back on him. Anyways, thanks for saving us." She hoped he didn't realize that her cheeks were bright red. What an incredible number. We really shouldn't have had any chance being attacked by this many. Holding up the hem of her dress and wadding through the dead bodies of the wild crows, Anne made her way to the driver's seat of the wagon. Jonas climbed out of his wagon as well and came up next to Anne. "You really saved us, Anne. Good thing you're using Shall." Being told this, Anne glanced over her shoulder at Shall with a troubled look on her face. Why yeah, I guess." Watching Anne from behind as she began walking again, Shall laughed bitterly. Anne had ordered Shall with all her might, in order to try and use him. However, her order held none of the cruelness of a master. Even if she threatened to destroy his wing, Shall was well aware that she could never follow through with it. However, Shall had protected them. It wasn't that he'd obeyed because he'd been ordered to do so. If Anne had been pecked to death by wild crows, Shall's wing that she carried would also have been in danger. That was the only reason he'd protected her. Anne was aware of the weakness of her own orders, and of the fact that Shall had seen through it. She had an inkling that Shall wasn't acting because of her orders. Her perception about those types of things seemed to be good. "You're holding my wing in your hands, for keep your wits about you, Scarecrow." Rather than a master, Anne was more like luggage. Since she was clutching his wing to her and wouldn't let go, he certainly couldn't treat her roughly. He couldn't let her leave his side. From Shall&Ann's perspective, it was as if he had a living jewelry box following him around, one which he'd lost the key to and couldn't open. Why was a helpless girl like this traveling around all by herself? It was a mystery. After calming the frightened horses down, Anne took them by the bit and slowly led them across the ground strewn with the dead bodies of wild crows. There were a terrifying number of corpses. Even though their lives would have been in danger if they hadn't done this, getting a first-hand experience of just how many lives that had been lost as they crunched beneath her feet made her spirits sink. Among these wild crows, there might have been some that left behind chicks in their nests. But she would need to find a way to compromise her feelings with acts like this in the future, should they be necessary to survive. That was unavoidable, because Emma, who'd always covered Anne's eyes and protected her from unpleasant and scary things, was no longer here. After a while, the horses regained their composure, and the wagon returned to travelling as usual. At last, Anne was able to sit back and rest on the driver's seat. However, she looked up at the sky and knit her brows. This isn't good. The sun was half hidden in the shadow of the mountains. The sky in the east was already growing a shade of dark indigo blue. Because of the wild crows' attack, they'd lost too much time. The way things stood now, it would be very difficult to reach the rest stop before the sun set. "It looks like we've leapt out of the frying pan and into the fire." 5. "What will you do? Are you going to wait out the night sleeping in the back of the wagon?" It seemed that Shall had caught on to the danger immediately. He said this from where he sat beside her on the driver's seat. "If we did that, I'd have to ask you to stay up all night keeping watch, Shall. You just chased the wild crows away for us. I couldn't put such a burden on you." "Leave it to me, I'll stay up all night and keep watch. This time for sure is my chance to shine." Seated between Anne and Shall, Mithril waved his hand enthusiastically, as if waiting to be called on. Anne smiled wryly. "If there's no other way, I'll ask you, but wait a minute." Pulling the map out from under the driver's seat, Anne traced the highway's path on the map with her finger. The rest stop she'd planned to spend the 4th night of the journey at was still far ahead. However, before the rest stop, just a bit further than where they were now, there was a different marking than the one for rest stop. It was a doctor's inn. Jonas pulled his wagon up beside Anne and looked up at the sky anxiously as well. "Anne, it's going to be dark soon. We might not have any choice but to run the rest of the way to the rest stop. As soon as it gets dark, wild beasts come out. It's dangerous to travel after night falls. We have to get to a safe place before then. If we travel a bit further, there's a doctor's inn. Let's take shelter there. If it turns out that this doctor's inn is closed, then it can't be helped. We can either run the rest of the way to the rest stop, or we can stop the wagons on the side of the road and spend the night in the back." As she spoke, Anne quickly put away the map. Jonas tilted his head. "What is a doctor's inn?" "Like the name says, it's the home of a doctor. Doctors working in remote places often run an inn in their home where they let travelers spend the night. Bandits also depend on doctors, right? So doctors' homes are safe because bandits will rarely do anything against them. However, if the doctor dies or moves away, the inn will close. It's best not to rely too much on doctors' inns while traveling, but we'll just have to pray that it's still there. Anyways, let's hurry." Anne applied the whip to the horses. Jonas set his face in a serious expression and drove his wagon forward as well. The sun sank mercilessly lower and lower as they watched. At the darkness that spread across the sky from the east, Anne felt a sense of terror. She applied the whip to the horses again, urging them even faster. However, Anne's horses were old. She didn't want to handle them roughly. If it were Emma, she would have been able to read the horses' level of exhaustion based on their breathing, and gotten them to run right at their maximum speed. Anne wasn't that skillful yet. As the darkness drew closer, her agitation increased. "Just a bit faster, I guess it's impossible, but what should I do? If it were Mama, she'd be able to do this right," Anne muttered, gazing straight ahead. Shall glanced over at Anne. What about your mother, where is she? The question caused a jolt of pain to shoot through her chest. In order to suppress that, Anne forced a smile. Then she said with fabricated cheerfulness, Mama died, I guess I forget to mention that. She saw a hint of surprise on Shah's normally expressionless face. My mother, who was a silver sugar master, died half a month ago. Because Mama and I were always travelling all throughout the kingdom, I have no home to return to. I also don't have any relatives except for Mama. After Mama died and I was thinking about how I should live from now on, I decided to become a silver sugar master. I intend to enter my sugar sculpture in the Sugar Sculpture Festival that's held in Lewiston at the end of fall and become a silver sugar master. I want to become a silver sugar master this year. Do you know why? Shall shrugged his shoulders. Of course he didn't know. Anne continued on. In order to avoid thinking of anything unnecessary, she fixed her eyes on the approaching darkness. She did her best to think only of hurrying forward as she moved her lips. Soul Ascension Day 6 is in the winter, right? It's a day of celebration to send off the souls of those who passed away the previous year. During that festival, I will create a magnificent sugar sculpture with my own hands as a silver sugar master and send Mama's soul to heaven. With my own hands, I'll make the best sugar sculpture in the entire kingdom. Don't you think that Mama will be able to go heaven without any worries when she sees it? It's a good idea, right? Anne rambled on and on, speaking in a cheerful tone of voice. She had the feeling that there was something in her chest that threatened to come overflowing out if she didn't seal it up like this. The reason why she wanted to make it in time for this year's Sugar Sculpture Festival. The reason why she wanted to become a silver sugar master this year. It was all because she wanted to send her mother off to heaven by making the world's best sugar sculpture with her own hands, which had been recognized as the most skillful in the whole kingdom. That was the only reason. She was well aware that it was a sentimental reason. But she was desperate. Right now that was Anne's only desire. Something right before her eyes. Something she could do for Emma. If she didn't have that to cling onto and continue chasing after, Anne felt that the ground would fall out from under her feet, and she would fall into a bottomless darkness. Shall gazed at Anne as if searching for something. She'd been told that he was being born from an obsidian. Indeed, those eyes were as beautiful and as deep as an obsidian. Anne felt that under that gaze her heart would be laid bare, and so she couldn't meet Shell's eyes. Since you're bomb from an object, that means fairies are bomb alone, right? That might also be nice. Without warning, a tiny fissure opened up in Anne's heart. For a moment, the frantic need to hurry receded into the distance. The only noise seemed to be that of the wind rattling around inside her empty chest. If you have a mother, it's hard once she's gone. It feels as if you've lost your heart. If you never had her in the first place, you could get by without experiencing this kind of pain. Anne muttered as if speaking to herself. At this, Shall answered quietly. Even if we're bomb alone, it doesn't mean that we'll never have to part with anyone. It's not as if fairies don't also know the pain of losing someone. After saying just that, Shall fell silent. Inside of Shall, there was a feeling similar to the one in Anne's heart. His silence confirmed it. However, that silence was unbearable. Anne felt that if she said anything more, the emotion that she was holding back inside of herself would overflow. That emotion that Anne was desperately holding back was unfathomable loneliness. There was certainly loneliness inside of Shall as well. It seemed that if those lonelinesses were ever to touch one another, they would overflow as one, and no one would be able to hold them back. Anne continued staring straight forward. So that's why her mother is gone. Gazing at Anne's face in profile as she stared obstinately straight ahead, Shall began to understand. He was also able to understand that Anne was unconsciously searching for someone to ease her loneliness. She was lonely. This scrawny 15-year-old girl was all alone. She was so terribly helpless. How terrible her sense of solitude must be. An oppressive feeling of solitude, as if the darkness would permeate into one's body. Shall also knew that feeling very well. Perhaps Anne even believed that if she entered the Sugar Sculpture Festival and was able to become a silver sugar master, that loneliness would disappear. Either that, or she believed that if she didn't dangle a target just out of reach to chase after like this, she would fall apart. Likely it was the latter. If that's the case, then let her chase after it. What he was recalling at that moment was the pain of having his wing torn off, That and the events that followed it. The separation that was more painful than losing his wing. Liz. At that time, to keep himself going, Shall had also continued running after things that were just out of reach. As long as he was doing that, he was able to get by without having to think about anything. That period was not a happy one for him, but neither was it unhappy. If the alternative was to fall apart, he wanted to let her chase after something. Even if the other person was a human, that's how he felt as someone who'd experienced the same feelings. Mithril was silent and gazed at Anne with a worried expression. Just then, Anne's stern expression suddenly grew cheerful. "Ah, look, lights." Off to the right side of the highway up ahead, where the entire sky was now almost completely stained a deep indigo blue, a snug little house surrounded by tall stone walls appeared, nestled in the shadow of the mountains. It was the doctor's inn. There was only a single opening in the stone walls, which were constructed using rocks of uneven size and shape. That was the gate. The gate was equipped with massive wooden double doors. Inside the gate, they could see a stone building with a wood-shingled roof. Warmly coloured light was leaking out from the windows. The massive gate doors affixed to the stone wall were just now beginning to close. "Wait," Anne shouted. Chapter 4: The Night at the Doctor's Inn. The person closing the gate was a middle-aged man. He was tall and thin, with a scraggly beard and dishevelled hair streaked with grey. However, Anne could sense intelligence in his features. "Wait, please, wait, please." Noticing Anne and Jonas's wagons coming towards him, the man waited for them with the gate half open. After pulling up in front of the gate, Anne stopped the wagon and got down from the driver's seat. She was in a hurry, but she didn't forget to bow her head politely. "I'm sorry to show up like this after it's already gotten so dark. Are you the doctor who lives here?" In response to her question, the man nodded. "We are travellers who were planning to stay at the rest stop a bit further ahead tonight. However, we were attacked by wild crows and lost time. There's no way we'll be able to make it to the rest area. Please, let us stay here tonight." Even if it were called a doctor's inn, in the end it was still the doctor's personal home. If the doctor said no, travellers couldn't stay there. Anne did her best to act properly and get the doctor to understand their plight. The doctor turned his eyes to Anne's carriage, examining it in the dim light. "Indeed, I can see that you were attacked by wild crows. There are marks on the outside walls of your wagon from being pecked repeatedly. You were lucky to get away." "It was because of him. He's a warrior fairy." Anne looked back at Shall, who sat on the driver's seat of her wagon. The doctor followed her gaze, turning towards Shall, and then said dreamily, "What a beautiful fairy. You don't usually get to see fairies like this. He's a warrior fairy, not a pet fairy." The doctor hobbled over to the driver's seat and looked up at Shall. He didn't move for a moment, staring at Shall in a daze, as if enchanted by him. The area had become completely dark by now, and the far-off howls of wolves could be heard. Anne was growing impatient, but she did her best to bear it. However, "Haven't you ever seen a fairy before, Scruffy?" Shall said in a fed-up-sounding voice. Anne paled and almost let out a shriek. "Hierog Shall, what are you saying?" Anne suddenly broke out in a cold sweat. Indeed, this doctor's hair and beard were both as scruffy as could be. Honestly, he was scruffy-looking. However, if they upset him, it wouldn't turn out well for them. As if awakening from a dream, the doctor blinked several times. Then he laughed as if ashamed of himself and turned back to Anne. "No, I'm sorry, that was rude of me. Living in a place like this, it's rare to see beautiful things, you see. Regardless, it seems you've had a hard time, eh? Come, spend the night here. The rate is 60 vine per person. If that's fine with you, then you can bring the 2 wagons and your horses inside the walls." Thank you very much." Anne wiped away the cold sweat and bowed her head low in relief. When they drove the wagons inside walls, they saw that another guest's wagon had already been brought inside. It was clear at first glance that the paint on the wagon of the guest who'd arrived before them was of the highest quality. It was a bit old, but the construction was elegant. Jonas, who'd pulled his wagon up next to that one, came up to Anne and said in a small voice, "Look, Anne, this is a high-class carriage. I wonder if the guest who's here already is someone of high social status. If so, I'll be nervous. We might have to be on our best behaviour, especially Shall. I'd like to get him to hold his tongue, but... While heading toward the door to the house, Anne looked up at Shall, who walked beside her with a severe expression on her face. Shall, I thought my heart was going to stop earlier. I can't believe you called the doctor scruffy. At this, Mithril, who hopped along behind Anne, raised his voice in censure. That's right. Rather than scruffy, you should have called him tottering. That's right, not scruffy but tottering. Wait a minute, that's not right. Anne yelled at the two fairies. Both scruffy and tottering are not okay. What will we do if you make him mad? We'll get kicked out. At this, Shall said calmly, he's not the type of human to get mad about something like that. You can tell just by looking at him. I harassed all sorts of humans during my time in the fairy market, so I have confidence in my instincts. We don't need your strange instincts. In any case, please stop harassing people. It's been my habit for many years, so I don't have confidence in my ability to stop now. At his point-blank response, Anne's shoulders slumped in resignation. It seemed that if Shall said something and made someone mad, Anne would have no choice but to bow her head and apologize with all her might. Opening the door, they stepped into the house. When they passed through the door, they entered into a large, unpartitioned room. A medicine cabinet and a wooden examination table were set along one wall. 3 mismatched tables of varying design and made out of different materials were placed along the other wall. It seemed that this room was functioning both as an examination room and a dining room. There was no sign of the guest who'd arrived before them. Perhaps they were resting in the room that had been assigned to them. The doctor led Anne's group to a door on the far wall. On the other side of the wall was a hallway running perpendicular to the door. At one end of the hallway was a room that appeared to be the kitchen. At the other end of the hallway was a room that appeared to be the bathroom. There were 3 doors lined up on each side of the hallway, which seemed to be guest rooms. Anne and Jonas were assigned 1 room each. There were 2 beds in the room assigned to Anne. A clean curtain was hung on the small window. The room was simple but comfortable looking. After you've put away your luggage and rested for a bit, come to the dining room. If you're okay with a simple soup, I can serve you some. The doctor returned to the dining room after saying this. In the first place, they didn't have enough luggage between them to require much time unpacking. More importantly, Anne's stomach was making gurgling noises. Jonas seemed to be the same, because he came to Anne's room to complain that he was hungry. Before long, they were hesitantly poking their faces into the dining room. In the dining room, the doctor had placed a large pot on one of the tables and was ladling soup into ceramic bowls. There were 2 young men sitting at a separate table from the one where the doctor was preparing the soup. Jonas whispered to Anne, "Those must be the guests who arrived before us. They're not dressed all that fancy, but..." The 2 young men were facing each other, playing a game of cards. One of them was a tall, solidly built young man. He had unruly brown hair that was sticking up in all directions. The shirt, pants and jacket that he wore were not gaudy, but appeared to be well made. However, there was something wild glinting fleetingly in his brown eyes that no amount of fine tailoring could conceal. The other person was an exotic-looking young man. He had a lean, muscular frame and brown skin. His hair was pure white and he had grey eyes. Something about him called to mind a large, sinuous feline. He was probably from one of the kingdoms on the continent. He wore leather pants and a leather vest, and there was a gently curved sword at his side. A person of high social status travelling in disguise and his bodyguard. Anne guessed that it must be something like that. The doctor noticed Anne's group and called out, "Oh, there you are. Come, the soup is ready." At the sound of his voice, the 2 young men turned their gazes towards the door from behind which Anne's face was peeking out. "Sit here, I'm not sure about the taste, but there's plenty to go around. Eat as much as you like." "Thank you very much," Anne replied politely, and they all entered the dining room. Anne and Jonas sat at the table where the doctor had placed the large pot. That's when Anne noticed that Shall and Mithril and Cassie as well were moving away from the table. Anne called out to them, "What is it, you 3, if you don't hurry up and sit down?" At this, the doctor and the 2 young men who'd arrived before them looked at Anne in surprise. What?" To Anne, who faltered under the weight of those gazes, Jonas whispered, "Anne, people don't usually eat with their fairies, right?" "I do. Normal people do. Even if this is a doctor's inn, it's still an inn, right? If you say things like that in public, people will think you have no common sense. Hearing these words, Anne realized that she had done something that deviated from the so-called common sense. However, at the same time, she felt herself getting angry. What was so fun about putting fairies down like this? I don't need to know common sense like that. I won't know it. Therefore, I want to eat with Shall&Ann them. Anne looked at the doctor. We've been eating together while traveling. I want to eat with them. If that's not allowed, then I won't eat either. I see. Personally, I'm not the type to care about things like that, but you see, right now there are other guests here too. Suddenly a loud laugh rang out, seeming to erase the doctor's mumbled words. Don't worry about it, it doesn't bother me either. The person who spoke was one of the guests who'd arrived earlier, the brown-haired young man. While laughing, he waved to Anne with one of his large hands. Say, miss, what's your name? It's Anne Halford. I'm Hugh. You don't need to hold back on our account, Anne. Call your fairies to the table. Thank you. His casual attitude and cheery smile eased the tense situation. Anne beckoned to the fairies, who were unsure about what was going on, to come to her table. As Anne's group began eating their soup, the man who'd called himself Hugh gathered up the cards he'd been playing into his hands. Then he turned towards Anne and began to speak to her from where he sat at the table beside hers. Where did you guys come from? Did you say where it was you were headed, and for what purpose you're crossing a dangerous highway like this? He, Jonas, is from Knoxbury Village. I've never stayed in one place ever since I was born, so I can't really say where I'm from. We're going to Lewiston. Then, puffing his chest out slightly, Jonas boasted, We're planning to participate in the Sugar Sculpture Festival that's being held in Lewiston. She and I are both sugar craftsmen. Oh, so you're sugar craftsmen, eh? But you're pretty well off for ordinary sugar craftsmen, aren't you? Traveling with 2 labor fairies and a pet fairy. Hugh stood up, grinning. He moved to Shall's side and peered down at him fixedly. This looks like it was expensive. Whose pet fairy is he? Shall had his hands cupped around the bowl of soup and was eating quietly. For just a moment he glanced over at Hugh with sharp eyes, but thankfully he said nothing. I bought Shall, but he's not a pet fairy, he's a warrior fairy. He's my guard. A warrior fairy? You lie, you don't need to be embarrassed. It's only natural for a girl your age, Elle, to want to travel around accompanied by a fairy that looks like this. Did you fall in love with him at first sight? Is that why you bought him? Anne knew that she was being made fun of. However, her embarrassment made her suddenly angry. It's not like that. Don't blush, don't blush. I'm telling you I understand how it is, so you don't need to lie. It's not a lie. Without thinking, her voice got louder. Hugh made an amused face and his eyes shined. Then shall we prove it? Hugh glanced over at the young man accompanying him, then he stepped back one step. The young man, who up until now had been so quiet it was if he'd erased his presence completely, reacted to Hugh's signal. Suddenly the young man grabbed the sword at his side and unsheathed it in one smooth movement, knocking over the chair as he did so. He looked like a hunting dog, crouching down and setting out at a run. His sword flew towards Shall. Shall. Even before Anne let out a shriek, Shall was on his feet and leaping back. Before the second swing of the sword came slashing towards him, a silvery white sword was materializing in Shall's hand. Shall used his sword to repel the sword that was swung down at him with all of its wielder's might. The swords clashed and the impact pierced through the air in waves. Not too bad, the brown-skinned young man muttered expressionlessly. The corners of Shall's mouth lifted in a faint smile as he whispered to his opponent, Do you want to die? Unfortunately, I'm not that rusty. The metallic noise of swords crashing together rang out. The two of them fought back and forth, neither backing down. I see, he is indeed a warrior fairy, Hugh said with a note of surprise, then grinned. That's enough, Salim, lower your sword. As ordered, the young man who'd been called Salim promptly lowered his sword. Shall shrugged, then loosened his stance and dismissed his sword as well. What on earth are you doing, you huge idiot? If there's so much as a scratch on my companion, you won't get away with this. Having come to her senses, Anne stood up and without thinking grabbed the front of Hugh's shirt. Sorry, come on, don't get so mad. I just couldn't believe what a fine warrior fairy you've got. I wanted to try him out and see, Hugh said, managing not to sound the least bit repentant. So you thought it was a good idea to do something like this? No, come on, that's why I'm apologizing, see? To make up for it, I'll pay you guys lodging fees. Do you really think you can get out of this that easy, eh? Our lodging fees, really? Without realizing it, Anne loosened her grip on his shirt front. In the past half a year, they'd spent quite a bit on Emma's medical treatment. Furthermore, Anne wasn't certain how much money she'd be able to earn by herself. They'd already gone through most of their savings by living off of them for the past 6 months, and Anne had used what little was left to buy Shall. If they paid the lodging fees here, Anne would be all but penniless. Hugh's proposal was extremely appealing. For 1, 2, 3, 5 people at 60 vine per person it comes to. 3 crez, eh? That's quite a bit just for an apology gift. What, you're the one who offered in the first place, right? I guess you're right, but somehow I feel like you're getting the better end of the deal. Oh, that's right. You guys said you were sugar craftsmen, right? Each of you make me 1 sculpture. If you do that, I'll pay the lodging fees for the 5 of you. Just the size of your fist is fine. For sugar sculptures of that size, the most you'd get for 2 is 10 vine, right? You'll end up earning 3 crez for the price of 10 vine. Not too bad, right? His manner of speaking gave Anne the feeling that she was being toyed with. However, the prospect of not having to pay the lodging fees was appealing. Anne turned to Jonas. Jonas nodded. I don't have any objections, Anne. For some reason, Jonas seemed happy. Anne turned back to Hugh and, though still a bit angry, said, Fine, we'll make the sugar sculptures. In exchange, you definitely have to pay our lodging fees. If you'd like, I'll get down on one knee and swear it. I don't need an insincere-sounding vow like that. Anyways, just wait a bit. We'll make them after we've finished eating. After they finished dinner, Anne went with Jonas out to the wagon to get the silver sugar. Inside the back of the wagon, barrels filled with silver sugar were lined up along one wall. There were 5 barrels. One was empty. Another was 2/3 of the way full of silver sugar. The remaining 3 were stuffed to the brim with silver sugar. Those participating in the Sugar Sculpture Festival in Lewiston would each submit 1 sugar sculpture suitable for a celebration. At the same time, they were also required to submit 3 barrels of silver sugar. The reason why was because it was not just their skill for crafting sugar sculptures that was being examined, but also their ability to secure high-quality sugar apples and refine them into silver sugar. Refining sugar apples into silver sugar had been Anne's job since the time she was 10 years old. We can't use 3 of the barrels, but there should be enough left in the 2/3 full barrel. Even if we were to make 10 sculptures the size of my fist, there should be more than enough left to make the sugar sculpture for the festival, Anne muttered while opening the lid to the barrel. She filled a stone bowl with silver sugar and handed it to Jonas. Then she filled another bowl for herself and exited the wagon. Anne almost couldn't believe her ears when Jonas said jovially as they walked towards the house, What are you getting so worked up about? I can't shake the feeling that he's making fun of us. Even so, displaying your skills in front of others is something to be proud of, isn't it? I guess you're right. Of course I am. I have confidence in my abilities. I'll tell you the truth, but you've got to keep it a secret. There's a high probability that I will be recommended as the next leader of the Ratcliffe Guild. The current leader of the Ratcliffe Guild, who is a distant relative of mine, by the way, was looking at one of my sugar sculptures. It seems that he's taken an interest in me. Of course, to become the leader of the guild, I'll first need to become a silver sugar master, but there were 3 main guilds of sugar craftsmen: the Mercury Guild, the Page Guild, and the Radcliffe Guild. If a sugar craftsman was not part of one of these 3 guilds, they would face opposition and have difficulties obtaining sugar apples, the raw materials for making silver sugar, and selling off the sugar sculptures they made. That was why most sugar craftsmen belonged to a guild. Naturally, since the guilds were in competition with one another for various things, there were occasional feuds. Anne's mother Emma hadn't belonged to a guild. Saying that she wasn't fond of the guild's way of doing things, she worked hard securing her own sugar apples and selling off her sugar sculptures. Based on the way Jonas pridefully conveyed this news, Anne got a sense that his worldview and values were completely different from her own. However, their desire to become silver sugar masters was the same. So you want to become a silver sugar master too? why don't you participate in this year's sugar sculpture festival? No, I participated last year and the year before and still haven't been able to become a silver sugar master. This year I'll just observe. I'll polish my skills a bit more and participate again next year. But in the long term, I definitely have to become a silver sugar master. If I don't, I won't be able to become the leader of the Ratcliffe Guild. I won't be able to become the silver sugar viscount either. At his mention of the silver sugar viscount, Anne's eyes widened. Jonas, you want to become the silver sugar viscount? The silver sugar viscount, one person among all of the silver sugar masters, who was chosen by the king to be the royal family's exclusive silver sugar master. Although it was only for one generation, the silver sugar master who was chosen would be given the title too of viscount. Each of the sugarcraft guilds had to obey the silver sugar viscount's orders. Disobeying his orders would be seen as disobeying a royal decree. Silver sugar viscount was the highest rank a sugar craftsman could possibly achieve. Yes, I want to. That is to say, I definitely will become the silver sugar viscount. After all, there's no more wonderful a dream than that of a commoner being able to become an aristocrat, right? So Anne. Jonas suddenly stopped walking. Following his lead, Anne stopped as well. Won't you marry me? I'm going to become a silver sugar master and the silver sugar viscount. I can promise you a happy life. The moon poked its face out between the clouds. Anne could see Jonas's face clearly. She should have been thrilled by these words. However, no matter how hard she tried to imagine a happy life with him, she couldn't picture it. Even looking into Jonas's finely featured face and hearing him speak these words, her heart didn't begin to race. Rather than Jonas, the figure that suddenly rose into her thoughts was Shall's. Anne herself was surprised that she'd recalled his face at a moment like this. I'm sorry, Jonas, let's leave this conversation at that for now. As they hurried into the house, Hugh was sitting at the table waiting for them. 2 chairs were lined up across from him. Salim, the doctor and the fairies were gathered around like an audience. All right, you two, sit in the chairs. I want you to make the sugar sculptures in front of me. On the table there were 2 containers filled with water for each of them, one deep and one shallow. There were also 2 cutting boards that looked like they'd been borrowed from the kitchen. Looking at the items laid out, Anne furrowed her brows and sat in the chair. There's no need to add colour. I'll leave the shape of the sculptures up to you as well. Can I ask a question first? Anne gazed at Hugh head-on. What is it? Who are you? You couldn't have prepared these tools without knowing how to make sugar sculptures, right? Could it be that you're also a sugar craftsman? Are you participating in the sugar sculpture festival? The comers of Hugh's mouth curled up wickedly. If you want me to pay your lodging fees, shut up and make the sugar sculpture, Anne. Well, I guess it's fine, as long as you pay our lodging fees. Anne poured water from one of the containers on the table into the stone bowl, holding the silver sugar. Beside her, Jonas began to do the same. After adding water to the silver sugar, Anne began to knead it. This made the sugar into a soft, clay-like substance. Normally, she would mix colour flakes into this and make various colours. It was normal to join these together and create a sugar sculpture that was rich in colour. However, this time she wouldn't be making colours. Anne transferred the clay-like substance onto the cutting board and continued to knead it. Because no tools for shaping the form had been prepared, she had no choice but to do it with her fingertips. Silver sugar melted easily if it came into contact with heat. When handling it, one had to cool one's fingers in cold water and work quickly. Anne cooled her fingers in the cold water set out on the table. It was said that a sugar craftsman's movements were like the sleight of hand of a street magician. They moved gently and smoothly. What should I make? Anne puzzled it over as she kneaded the silver sugar. I wonder what Mama would make if it were her. If it were Emma, she'd probably use the white colour to an advantage and make something white. Emma liked plant motifs, so she would make a white flower. That decided, Anne recalled the shape of the flowers Emma had often made. She sculpted the shape of flower petals with her fingertips, making many of them. Joining them together, she began to form the flower. Jonas was making a cat that could fit in the palm of his hand. It seemed that he was trying to show off his skill with the long, graceful curves of the cat's tail. Looking at the cat taking form under Jonas's fingertips, Kathy whispered, The things Jonas-sama makes really are incredible. It didn't take long. Both of them stopped working and raised their faces at the same time. Done's both of you. At Hugh's question, Jonas nodded, full of confidence, and pointed a finger at the top of the cutting board. It's done. I'm done too. Anne set the item she'd made on her cutting board as well. Hugh pulled the cutting boards with each of their completed works on top of them toward him. He looked at each in turn for a few moments, but then he laughed lightly, foo foo foo. Both of you are pretty skilled, you don't have the feel of novice craftsmen at all. Anne and Jonas looked at each other and smiled. However, the very next moment, Hugh simultaneously crushed both sculptures under his palms. Anne and Jonas raised their voices in protest. Oh, what are you doing? Hugh regarded them with a stern expression. They were painful to look at, so I broke them. Jonas, you are skilled, but that's all. Just because you have a little skill, you're content merely with showing off that shows no ingenuity at all. Anne, you were better than Jonas. But what was that? It seemed like you were copying exactly something someone else had made. Monkey see, monkey do. There's no appeal at all in a sculpture that's merely pretty. Eating something like that wouldn't bring me luck, nor would it extend a fairy's lifespan, right? If this is the best you'd got, becoming a silver sugar master is still a far-off dream for the two of you. Both Anne and Jonas wanted to protest, but their voices wouldn't come out. Anne felt like the wind had been knocked out of her. He'd precisely hit upon something like a weakness that she'd been unconsciously sensing in her own sculpture. Jonas must have felt the same. His expression became stiff. Well, I guess I'll keep these cracked pieces of sugar sculpture. They can be my snack for tomorrow. Hugh put the scattered pieces of sugar sculpture into a container he had on hand and then stood up. Well then, I'm going to bed. We have to be up early tomorrow. Come one, Salim. See you later, Anne. Jonas. This was a good diversion. I had fun. Followed by Salim, Hugh exited the room. The doctor was dumbfounded. Kathy came running up to Jonas, who stood motionless. Then she yelled in a high-pitched voice, "What was he thinking, that man?" Jumping up onto the table, she began to stroke Jonas's hand. "Jonas-sama, this is nothing to get upset over. You mustn't take the words of a strange man of unknown origins seriously." "I guess that's true." Jonas smiled bitterly and glanced over at Anne. "Sorry, Anne, I'm going back to my room." Anne lifted her head suddenly. "Me too, I'm going back too." While yelling this, Anne ran off towards her room. How mortifying. Anne was ashamed of herself. "Hey, Shall&Ann, do you really intend to go back to the room?" Watching Anne run off, Shall sighed. Then he started to walk slowly after her, intending to return to the room himself. That was when Mithril shouted at his back in horror. Turning back, he answered, "Yes. I'm telling you, you should stop. What's wrong about going back to the room?" After being told things like that, Anne was really hurt and might even be crying, you know. If you're not careful, she may even become violent. If you nonchalantly show your face in there, you're going to be hated for sure. "I don't really care." "Well, I'm not going. I'll sleep here in the dining room tonight. As you like." On his way back to the room, Shall came to the conclusion that Hugh's judgment was correct. Looking at the sculpture Anne had made, Shall had felt the same way. Anne herself probably had as well. Likely that's why she was so hurt. When he opened the door, the interior of the room was pitch black. Anne was laying on her bed, curled up in a ball with the blanket pulled up over her head. Shall sat down on the bed next to Anne and gazed at the lump under the blanket. She looked just like a bagworm. 3. Liz. Looking at Anne in her current state, Shall unexpectedly remembered. Liz too, when she was young, she'd pout and cry and often curled up in a ball under the blankets. How old was she back then? 9 or maybe 10. When she got older, she stopped doing that. He looked at the bagworm in front of him once more. Is she really 15 years old? Even after turning 15, Anne still had some of this immaturity remaining. The reason why was probably because in the 15 years until now she'd lived happily, protected by her mother. Thinking this, Shall got the feeling that he'd found a last warm flicker of lamplight. There was something charming about seeing Anne, who was always insisting that she was mature, and an adult act like a 10-year-old child. In spite of himself, he chuckled lightly. Immediately, Anne sat up. What's so funny? Do you really find other people getting depressed that interesting? Her eyes were bright red, and tears welled up in the corners, threatening to spill over. They shimmered in the light of the moon slashing in through the window. It seemed she was trying with all her might to keep from crying. Her face, as she bit her lip, holding back the brimming tears, was even more childish. He knew he shouldn't, but he couldn't help the put that leaked out. Frantically, Shall covered his mouth with both hands. What, looking at people's faces makes you laugh? Certainly a scarecrow like me is an unseemly sight. My face when I'm plunged into grief and crying must be amusing. I'll be sneered at my whole life by people like you who have beautiful faces. Anne screamed, then thrust her face into the pillow dramatically. It was unforgivably rude to Anne, who was hurt and in great uproar, but for some reason Shall's mood was extremely peaceful. It seemed like he was about to remember something he'd forgotten. Shall stood, then sat on the bed where Anne lay in a heap. That's right, when I first met Liz her hair was this colour, I'd forgotten. Unconsciously, Shall took a strand of Anne's hair that was spread out on the sheets in his hand. You won't be laughed at your whole life. Humans are different from us. Humans are always changing. After about 3 years have passed, you will become shockingly beautiful. This hair will turn a pretty light blonde. At that time, there won't be anyone who will call you a scarecrow. Your skill at making sugar sculptures will have changed as well. What Hugh said was the truth, but there's no need to take it to heart. Doubtfully, Anne raised her head slowly from the pillow, only showing half of her face to him. As for sugar sculpture making, I will polish my skills more. I'll definitely improve, you'll see. If it's something I can make happen through hard work, I'll find a way. But I don't need you to comfort me with obvious lies like me becoming a beauty. It's not a lie. Shall dropped his gaze to the strand of hair in his hand. When I was bomb, the first thing I saw was a human child, a 5-year-old girl. She had hair this colour. It seems that I was born from that girl's gaze. This was a memory from the distant past. For some reason, he found himself wanting to try speaking it out loud. Somewhere inside him there was something like a fleeting hope that doing so might bring something that was lost back to life. Anne made a shocked-looking face as Shall began to tell this tale. The girl's name was Elizabeth. Liz. She was the daughter of an aristocrat, and due to special circumstances she was living in seclusion from society. She was young and knew nothing of the world. Liz didn't know what a fairy was, so it seemed she misunderstood and thought that I was her older brother. She brought me back to her mansion and hid me there. Anne raised her face from the pillow and sat back up on the bed. The strand of hair that Shall had been holding slipped out of his hand. Shall lightly clenched his now empty hand. He gazed at his clenched fist. After that we were always together. After 15 years passed, Liz's hair turned blonde and her freckles disappeared. She became a beautiful young woman, so I know. You will also change like Liz did. What happened after that? At her question, Shall raised his face. After that was Liz always with you? Why isn't she here anymore? Shall closed his eyes. At this question, pain shot through his chest, even though 100 years had already passed. She died, she was murdered, the ones who killed her were humans. Anne hung her head at these words. After a moment, Anne's hand gently touched Shall's clenched fist. I'm sorry. Shall didn't know what Anne was apologizing for. Perhaps her guilt at making Shall talk about such painful memories. Either that or perhaps her guilt as a fellow human for killing Liz. All he was certain of was the warmth in her heart. Shall shook his head slightly and stood up. Anne's hand slid off of his fist. He said too much. Go to bed now, Scarecrow, he said quietly over his shoulder. Memories are just memories, they don't come back to life. When Anne awoke the next morning, Hugh had already departed. It seemed he had left before dawn. However, he'd paid their lodging fees as promised. What was Hugh's true identity? However, Anne didn't think too deeply about this issue. Additionally, the shock of Hugh's words had all but worn off. More than that, the fragments of Shall's past that he had revealed to her reverberated deep in Anne's chest. After departing from the doctor's inn, 3 days passed without them being attacked by bandits or wild beasts. That entire time, Anne did nothing but steal glances at Shall, who sat beside her. Shall had said that he couldn't be friends with a human. But when he was first born, he had opened his heart to a human girl. He said they'd been together for 15 years. It was exactly as long as the time Anne had spent with her mother. Perhaps that girl Liz had been like family to Shall, and he'd lost her at the hands of humans. Anne's chest had ached seeing Shall with his eyes closed, wearing a sad expression. Shall had opened his heart to a human, and the ones who caused him to freeze his heart away had also been humans. I wish there was some kind of magic I could use to melt Shall's heart. Anne thought of nothing but this while driving the wagon, and she was constantly aware of Shall's face at the corner of her vision. This was the 7th day since they'd begun to cross the bloody highway. They made it 2/3 of the way across. Lowering the iron gate to the rest stop, Anne was struck by the fact that they made it 2/3 of the way there. They entered the rest stop and quickly had dinner. Anne had a simple soup and an apple. Jonas's dinner was, as always, luxurious. As they travelled, Jonas had continued to offer to share his food with Anne, but Anne declined each time. It was dangerous to become accustomed to luxury on the road. You never knew what might happen while travelling, so it was essential to bring along as much food as possible and use it sparingly. Jonas soon retreated into the back of his wagon, taking Cassie with him. Mithril had finally stopped constantly insisting that she let him repay the favour. However, he sat on the driver's seat during the day wearing a matter-of-fact expression. At night, he gathered grasses which he used to make a bed for himself on the roof of the wagon, and he curled up to sleep there. Tonight as well, he diligently made himself a bed, laid down in it, and soon he was snoring away. Anne still couldn't think up a favour to ask that would satisfy my thrill. He'd probably follow her around forever until she could think one up. Anne had already gotten used to Mithril's shrill voice. It was mysterious, but once you got used to it, Mithril's arrogance was also cute. Anne sat around the fire with Shall, getting ready for bed. Shall set an apple on the palm of his hand and began eating it. First, wrinkles started to form on the surface of the apple in his hand. Finally, the apple imploded with a splat and, coiling up on top of his hand, melted. This was how fairies ate. No matter how many times she saw it, it seemed mysterious to Anne. It's pretty cold tonight, huh? As expected, the closer we get to the end of fall, the colder it gets. Aren't you cold? We don't feel the cold like humans do. That's convenient. Just after answering, Anne sneezed. It really was cold. Shall glanced over at the wagon where Jonas slept, then asked, "You won't sleep inside the wagon? You should sleep in a warm place like that guy does." Anne pulled a blanket out from under the driver's seat and shook her head lightly while carrying it back to the fire. "I don't know what Jonas's wagon is for, but mine is a workshop for making sugar sculptures. It's a sacred place. I can't sleep in a place like that. Neither Mama nor I have ever once slept inside the wagon. During the winter, we'd intentionally stay at an inn. Mama's motto was, sugar sculptures are a sacred food, so the places and people that make them mustn't be dirtied." Gazing into the flames, Shall said in response, "It sounds like she was a fine craftsman, your mother." Hearing this, Anne recalled Emma's face. A feeling of overwhelming sadness came over her. Yeah, she really was. That night, try as she might, Anne couldn't fall asleep. "I'm lonely." Those feelings were welling up her heart, like a countless number of bubbles. "I wonder if Shall feels this way too." Anne rolled over for the umpteenth time and turned her gaze towards Shall. Shall lay 5 or 6 paces away. She wanted to shorten that distance. Is he asleep? Or else maybe he's got his eyes closed and is thinking about something. I want to talk. Anne was assaulted by the impulse to stretch out her hand and touch his wing, which was spread out on the grass. She rose slightly and began to reach out. However, she hesitated and her hand stopped. If I touch his wing while he's sleeping, I know what I'll say. Shall would surely be enraged if his precious remaining wing were touched by a human. Magic to melt Shall's heart. Just then, Anne suddenly remembered about the sugar sculpture. She promised she'd make him one, but then Mithril had appeared and she'd completely forgotten. It didn't seem like she was going to be able to sleep, so Anne got up. "I'll make the promised sugar sculpture." She hoped the sweet sugar sculpture would warm Shall's heart, even if just a little. Anne opened the doors on the back of the wagon and went inside. The light of the moon, which was only a sliver shy of a full moon, poured in through the windows. Relying on that, Anne slid her hand along the cold, stone work table, touching the scales and stroking the neatly arranged wooden spatulas. Emma was in here. All of these things which Emma had once touched were resting silently. Something else entered Anne's ears along with the silence, sending her heart racing. Shaking her head, Anne turned towards the barrels of silver sugar. We ended up making sugar sculptures for Hugh, but there should be plenty of silver sugar left. I can probably make 2 or 3 for Shall. While whispering this, Anne opened the lid to the barrel. Anne was sure that the barrel she'd opened had been more than half full of silver sugar. But the barrel was completely empty. Perhaps she'd opened the empty barrel by mistake. Thinking this, Anne opened the lid of the barrel that she'd thought was the empty one. That barrel was empty too. Why? Anne was astounded, her pulse sped up. One by one she opened the lids of the remaining barrels. The remaining 3 were full of silver sugar. Out of the 5 barrels, 2 were empty. Only the ingredients for making a sugar sculpture to enter into the Sugar Sculpture Festival had completely vanished. Chapter 5, Sugar Apple of the Poison Tree. With her hand on the rim of the empty barrel, Anne sank to her knees right there. It can't be, why isn't it here? The barrel was more than halfway full when we used some silver sugar at the doctor's inn, I checked, and the wagon doors were locked. Like this, even if they made it to Lewiston, she couldn't participate in the Sugar Sculpture Festival. If she made a sugar sculpture, she'd be short of the predetermined 3 barrels of silver sugar and would be disqualified. But if she made sure to preserve the 3 barrels of silver sugar, she wouldn't have the ingredients to make a sugar sculpture. Why, no one's been in the wagon, so why? Anne screamed. What are you making a fuss about? From outside the open wagon doors came Shell's voice. Anne stood up, her legs were weak and she staggered. It was like she was picking her way across on a street piled with fallen leaves. Just as she began to descend the wagon steps, Anne stumbled and clung to Shall. What happened? The silver sugar, it's gone. Gone. There are 3 barrels left, but to participate in the festival, 3 barrels of silver sugar and a sculpture are required. There's no sugar left to make the sculpture with. Shall furrowed his brows. Was it there back at the doctor's inn? It was there back then, I checked, and I locked the doors afterwards. No one should have been able to get in or out, and yet the silver sugar was gone. Anne's fingers gripping Shall's sleeve trembled slightly, her vision blurred. She couldn't understand why the silver sugar wasn't there. Anne, what's wrong? Seemingly having heard the commotion, Jonas came out of his wagon, followed by Kathy. Then, seeing Anne clinging to Shall, he tilted his head suspiciously. Anne thought she was going to cry if she tried to speak. In place of Anne, who couldn't answer Jonas's question, Shall said, "It seems the silver sugar is gone." But the silver sugar was in your wagon, right? You locked it, so no one should have been able to get in or out, right? No, they were able to get in and out. The one who said this in a tormented voice was Kathy. Picking up on the implications of these words, everyone's gazes turned towards her. What do you mean, Cassie? At Jonas's question, Kathy hung her head. I don't want to say something that betrays another of my species, but I saw it. The night we stayed at the doctor's inn, I was looking out the window of our room. There's a window high up on the side of Anne's Sama, wagon right. I saw Mithril Reed Pod coming out of there. In the moonlight it looked like his whole body was shimmering. He was covered in silver sugar. Mithril. What's going on? You guys are so noisy, all gathering around over here. What are you talking about? Rubbing at eyes heavy with sleep, Mithril poked his head out from on top of the roof of the wagon. It can be, but only a small fairy could have gotten into the wagon when it was locked. Furthermore, that night, it's true that Mithril was the only one sleeping in the dining room. Anne examined Mithril's face. She wanted to believe he wouldn't do something like that. Mithril, come down here, Jonas ordered in a stem voice. What? I'm not being used by you, don't get so haughty. Furthermore, don't shorten my name, it's Mithril Reed Pod. Get down here right now. At the ire in Jonas's voice and the tension in the air, Mithril's expression suddenly turned fearful. Coming down from the roof, he looked up at Anne timidly. What is it? Do you like silver sugar? At Jonas's question, Mithril nodded. I like it, as if there were any fairy that didn't like silver sugar. What's this about? What happened? On the night we stayed at the doctor's inn, you slept in the dining room alone, right? You had some kind of ulterior motive for doing that, didn't you? Some of the silver sugar that Anne prepared for the Sugar Sculpture Festival has gone missing. The night we stayed at the doctor's inn, Kathy saw you coming out the window of Anne's wagon covered in silver sugar. Hearing this, Mithril widened his eyes and opened his mouth in shock. But then, seeming to become enraged, he turned to Kathy and shrieked, what? What are you saying, even though you're also a fairy? You said I did something like that. Kathy moved to hide behind Jonas and said in a weak voice, but I saw you. Liar, Mithril shouted, then returned his gaze to Anne. He looked at Anne with frightened-looking eyes. Anne, I'm not the one who stole the silver sugar. Kathy's a liar. What does Kathy have to gain from lying? As if to deflect Jonas's accusing words, Mithril shouted, Shut up, human. Then he further beseeched Anne, Anne, don't tell me even you are doubting me. It wasn't me, I swear it wasn't me. Mithril spun these words tearily. Anne wanted to believe those words, but there was no proof to dispel her doubts. Don't tell me, no, it can't be, but… Doubts spun around in Anne's heart like a maelstrom. Even though she felt that she wanted to believe him, she couldn't help but wonder. These feelings must have been reflected on her face. Tears began to well up in the eyes with which Mithril regarded Anne's face. You're doubting me, aren't you, Anne? You don't believe me, Anne. I want to believe you. But you don't believe me, do you? Even a little you doubt me. Tears overflowed from Mithril's eyes. I get it. If you're going to look at me like that, I'll disappear from your sight immediately. Shouting this, Mithril took a giant leap. He jumped right over the wagon and disappeared somewhere on the other side. Mithril, wait. Anne tried to call out to stop him, but her voice died out suddenly. What right did she have to call Mithril back when she couldn't even believe in him completely? Even if she told him, I believe you, if she wasn't able to wipe the doubt off her face while she said it, he'd only be hurt. The strength left her body. Anne's hand slipped from Shell's sleeve and she sank down to sit on the step of the wagon. She covered her face with both hands. With this, I can't participate in the Sugar Sculpture Festival this year anymore. Shell was silent, gazing off in the direction Mithril had disappeared. Jonas braced his chin in his hand, deep in thought. Then, after a moment, he snapped his fingers. I've got it, say Anne, you don't have to give up. If you only need to make one sculpture, you can just make that much silver sugar right now, right? It's impossible. In the first place, we don't have the raw materials, sugar apples. There are sugar apples. There is a grove of sugar apple trees along the bloody highway. I heard about it at a guild meeting for the Ratcliffe Guild. It seems that no one comes to harvest the sugar apples because hiring a guard and travelling all the way here is too much trouble to be worth it. It's autumn now, so the fruit should be ripe. The sugar apple tree was a mysterious tree. If humans tried to cultivate sugar apple trees, no matter what they did, the trees wouldn't bear fruit. Only sugar apple trees that grew wild in nature would bear fruit. That's why sugar craftsmen were desperate to know the location of sugar apple forests and how they could secure the fruit for themselves. If it came up at a guild meeting of the Ratcliffe Guild, then there was a high probability that there was indeed a sugar apple forest here. However, even if there is a grove of sugar apple trees, it will take 3 days to distill the silver sugar. If we spend that much time on the bloody highway, there won't be time to make the sugar sculpture for the festival once we arrive in Lewiston. In that case, during the 3 days it takes to distill the silver sugar, you can just use the silver sugar you have left now to make the sugar sculpture for the festival, right? You can distill the silver sugar and make the sugar sculpture at the same time. That way, as long as you can finish the sugar sculpture and distill enough silver sugar to replace the amount you used making it, all you need to do is continue on to Lewiston. Anne was about to say that it was impossible, but then Anne's brain finally began to work right again. It might not necessarily be impossible after all. Raising her head, Anne looked at Jonas. As if to give her courage, Jonas nodded. You can do it. Cheer up, Anne. I'm also not too shabby of a sugar craftsman. I'll help you. Jonas vigorously clapped his hands on Anne's shoulders. Anne's heart overflowed with gratitude for his kindness, and for bringing her information she could use in her current predicament. "Thank you, Jonas." Finally, Anne was able to smile a bit, then she looked up at Shall. "Sorry, Shall, I got pretty shaken up, even though you'd just fallen asleep. I woke you up right." "It doesn't matter." 3 days later, Anne drove the wagon forward single-mindedly, thinking only of making progress. During the day, she rarely stopped to take a break. It was dangerous at night, so they couldn't continue traveling. They would take shelter in a rest stop and wait impatiently for morning to come. Fortunately, they were not attacked by bandits or wild beasts, and after noon on the third day they arrived at the rest stop that was believed to be close to the grove of sugar apple trees. The imperial city of Lewiston was half a day's travel from here. The final rest stop was built on top of a short hill. From there one could see far off into the wilderness. On the distant side of a sparse forest and across a wide, meandering river the spires of the royal palace could be seen, appearing tiny from this distance. It finally became real to Anne that Lewiston was right before her. However, although Lewiston was right in front of her, Anne couldn't leave where she was now, her hands curled into fists. "I need to quickly obtain those sugar apples." The next morning, together with the break of day, Anne and Jonas left with the wagon. Leaving the highway, the two of them walked around, frequently consulting the map, searching for the sugar apple trees located in the middle of the wilderness. Then, when the sun was already high in the sky, the sight of bright red fruits caught Anne's eye. Sugar apples. Rather than happiness, it was a sense of relief that hit her like a wave. Sugar apple trees were short. At most they grew to a bit higher than the top of Anne's head. An endless number of little branches about the width of human fingers grew out of the trees, thin trunks, giving them a delicate appearance. At the ends of those little branches hung deep red fruits the size of chicken eggs. They looked very similar to ordinary apples. They were so red and lustrous they looked as if they'd been dipped in wax. At the fact that they'd discovered the grove of sugar apple trees unexpectedly quickly, enthusiasm welled up inside Anne. "We'll make it in time. As long as I make the sugar sculpture at the same time while distilling these sugar apples, we'll make it to Lewiston with time to spare." Anne got down from the driver's seat and got a basket out of the wagon. Jonas helped her to toss the sugar apples one after another into the basket. In the blink of an eye, the basket was full of sugar apples, which they transferred to the wagon before filling the basket a second time. After repeating this process 5 or 6 times, the floor of the wagon was so covered with red that there was no place left to walk. Looking at the red color of the sugar apples made Anne cheerful. Emma had also often said that. For the past 3 days, they'd been sprinting across the highway. Thanks to that, her hazy feelings regarding the situation with my thrill and her own character had been blown out behind them. More importantly, she was looking to the path ahead. If she wanted to make her dreams come true, instead of wasting her time worrying about things that couldn't be changed, she should chase after the things she could. If she worked hard, she would make it in time. "I'm going to start working immediately." After returning to the rest stop with the wagon packed full of sugar apples, Anne rolled up her sleeves. While unloading a giant pot and ladle from the wagon, Anne turned to Shall, who lay on the driver's seat with his legs dangling lazily off the side, and called out, "I'll make your sugar sculpture right after I finish making the one for the festival. Wait a bit longer, okay?" "Just make it edible." Anne laughed off his hateful reply. "I told you before, I'll let you see my skill for yourself," Anne responded in a lively voice, and then began to hum as she tossed sugar apples into the large pot. Shall sat up just a bit and watched Anne, who seemed to be enjoying her work. The sugar apple tree was also known as the poison tree. 1. They bore lustrous red, delicious-looking fruits that were the raw material for making silver sugar. If, knowing this, one were to take a bite, they'd find the sugar apple to be bitter, astringent, and completely inedible. It was a tree that bore fruit which defied all expectations. That same fickle fruit, in the hands of a sugar craftsman, would yield a high-quality sweetness. First, a sugar craftsman would fill a large pot with water and add a single handful of silver sugar. Then they'd put freshly harvested sugar apples into the pot and leave them to soak like that overnight. This would draw out the bitterness from the sugar apples. After this, they would discard the water, Then fill the pot with fresh water and set it over the fire. The sugar apples would break down as they boiled, and the seeds and skin would come floating to the surface, which the sugar craftsman would scoop out along with the astringent foam. When the mixture became syrupy, the sugar craftsman would transfer it from the pot to a flat stone dish. They would smooth it out to an even thickness and leave it to dry for another entire day. After this, the color would change, and it would harden into a pure white block. Finally, the sugar craftsman would grind it with a mortar and pedestal into a fine powder. After all of this, a pure white silver sugar with a faint bluish tint was produced. Silver sugar was different from regular sugar, which was gritty, yellowish and distilled from millet. Its smooth texture like fine-grained sand, and its whiteness, not to mention the refreshing sweet aftertaste it possessed, set silver sugar apart as a holy food. Once she'd finished submerging the sugar apples in the water, Anne promptly began to work on the sculpture for the Sugar Sculpture Festival. What she was supposed to make was a large sculpture appropriate for a celebration. Anne entered the wagon and took out a bundle of papers from underneath the work table. The bundle of yellowed papers of various shapes and sizes was tied with string. Anne untied the string and spread the pages out on the work table. The designs of sugar sculptures were drawn on those papers. They'd been drawn using a crude feather pen, so the lines were jagged and splotchy. Notes about the shape and color were jotted down in an unruly penmanship. These were drawings that Emma had amassed over time, continuously adding new designs. When she was going to make a sugar sculpture, Emma would first spread out these design charts and chose what to make from among them. "This is the fortune that Mama created. I can't give it to anyone. It's something I must never allow anyone to replicate," Emma had said, pointing to this bundle. While traveling, Emma would sell sugar sculptures made by Anne for a cheap price to customers looking for something inexpensive. At those times, Anne would make a sugar sculpture with the design Emma assigned her. Right now, Emma wasn't here to tell her, "Use this design." Anne had to choose for herself. At a loss, she selected a flower motif that Emma had been fond of. The flowers were a light pink color. The leaves were light green and blue, and white butterflies were perched on the flowers. It was a lovely design. Just then, Hugh's words from the night at the doctor's inn echoed in her ears. "Monkey see, monkey do." Then, what should I do so that I don't seem like a monkey mimicking someone else? I don't know. While thinking this, Anne placed the yellowed paper on the work table and took out bottles of red, green and blue color flakes. She cooled her hands with water from a bucket, then, taking up a stone bowl, headed towards the barrel full of silver sugar. She was just about to begin scooping silver sugar from the barrel when, Anne. There was a knock on the door of the wagon, and then it opened. Jonas peeked his head in. "Do you have enough barrels to hold all the silver sugar you're distilling now? I had this one in my wagon, would you like to use it?" Jonas entered the wagon clutching a small barrel. Anne gave a wry smile. "So far I've only soaked the apples in water. It will be a while before they're finished distilling. Besides, I have 2 empty barrels." "Oh, I see. Well, since I went to all the trouble of bringing it over, I'll leave it here for now." The wagon rocked as Jonas set the barrel on the floor with a thump. Anne's eyes widened. "That's an empty barrel, right? It seems pretty heavy for just an empty barrel. Is it extremely sturdily made?" "It's from my father's workshop, so it's a first-class piece of merchandise. It prevents the silver sugar from getting damp." "Thanks, but why did you bring something like that with you on a journey?" "I had the feeling it would come in handy, one way or another. More importantly, have you decided what you're going to make?" "Yeah, just you wait and see. I'll finish the sculpture before the sugar apples that are soaking in water now are done being distilled." "I'm looking forward to it." Jonas suddenly drew close to Anne and put his hand on her cheek. What? Jonas chuckled and once again approached Anne, who jumped back in shock. "Do your best, Anne." Both of Jonas's hands came down on Anne's shoulders, and his face drew so close to hers that she could feel his breath. Anne unconsciously shielded her face with the stone bowl in her hands. What? Jonas, hold on, what are you doing? Knock it off." "Don't be so crass, Anne." Pushing away the stone bowl with one hand, Jonas put his other hand on Anne's hip and drew her closer. He smiled down at her. "I love you, Anne. But I don't feel that way. I love you." Jonas's lips loomed closer. No. Anne's palm connected with Jonas's cheek in a direct hit. Jonas braced his cheek in astonishment, removed his hands from Anne's waist and took a step back. Why, Anne? Isn't it obvious I don't love you? But I love you. Those are your feelings, right? They have nothing to do with me, Anne shouted, realizing that she wasn't capable of harboring any romantic feelings whatsoever for Jonas. She had been bewildered and excited by his proposal and his kind words. But the truth was, when he'd drawn her close and been about to kiss her, a sensation of fear had swept over her. Jonas made a face like he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Perhaps that was only natural. Since the time he was young, Jonas had been the most popular person in the village, and all the girls had been set on becoming his girlfriend. Perhaps that was why he seemed to think that it was only natural that any and every girl would be in love with him. I see, I was hoping that you'd fall in love with me. Seemingly hurt, Jonas laughed slightly. Anne finally regained her composure. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to hit you. It's fine, I was being too forceful. That reminds me, it would be a waste of time for you to stop and cook while you're working on your sugar sculpture, right? I'll bring you something to eat later. Okay, thanks. Jonas smiled, then left. Anne heaved a giant sigh. The fact that he was worried about her meals after she'd just hit him made Anne think that Jonas really was a good person after all. I guess if I was in love with Jonas, I wouldn't be doing something like this, would I? Muttering this, Anne returned to work. While she was scooping silver sugar out of the barrel, there was a knock on the door and it was opened a second time. The person who entered was Kathy, carrying a small, heavy-looking basket. This is from Jonas Zama. I was instructed to deliver food to you. Where should I put it? Thank you, Cassie. Please put it under the work table over there. I'll eat it later. As Anne continued measuring out the silver sugar without raising her head, Kathy leapt up onto the work table. I'm going to give you a word of advice. Anne raised her head and found Kathy regarding her with a terribly cold expression. Even though Jonas Zama told you he likes you and even proposed marriage to you, you shouldn't get so full of yourself. I don't remember getting full of myself, but... Anne was bewildered by Kathy's sudden accusation. Don't you think that there's no reason Jonas Zama should honestly be interested in someone like you? Hearing these prickly words, Anne tilted her head. She got the feeling that she'd been told something similar by someone wearing a similar expression before. Where was that? It had to have been in Knoxbury Village. Suddenly she remembered. Cassie, could it be that you're in love with Jonas? Immediately, Kathy's cheeks turned as bright a red as her hair. What did you say? Even her voice was distorted. Her behavior was exactly like that of the girls in Knoxbury Village. They were jealous of Anne for staying at Jonas's house and often harassed her because of it. Once she realized this, Anne became friendly towards Kathy. That's nice. You must be happy that the person you love has your wing, right? It's much better than someone you hate or someone who looks down on you having it. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm telling you to stop being so full of yourself. It would be wonderful if love between a fairy and a human could work out. You really are an idiot, aren't you? I'm not going to waste my time talking to you. Squaring her shoulders, Kathy stormed out of the wagon. Compared to Kathy, Shall is really unfortunate. His wing is possessed by someone like me, who he clearly thinks of as an idiot from the bottom of his heart. The door was open a crack, through which Anne could see Shall's shoulder as he sat by the fire. Shah's wing, which lay flowing out on the grass behind him, reflected the light of the fire, shining a brilliant scarlet colour. Love between a fairy and a human. A thought struck her suddenly. Could Shall have possibly been in love with the human girl, Liz, to whom he'd once opened his heart? As soon as she thought this, her chest constricted painfully. Unaware of the reason for this pain, Anne was suspicious of her own feelings. And what is it? The girl named Liz who dwelled within Shall's memories. For some reason, Anne was extremely jealous of her. Regardless, Lamb Shall's master after all. Shall is only with me because I have his wing, so as I promised I have to free him once we arrive in Lewiston. At this thought it felt as if a cold wind was blowing inside her chest. That wind whispered faintly to her, "You're lonely, aren't you?" In order not to hear that whisper, Anne shook free from the wind and returned to work. Anne added cold water to the silver sugar and began to knead it. The silver sugar took on the texture of soft clay. Mixing color flakes into this, Anne created color. She repeated this many times with different colors. Anne began to shape the colored silver sugar, sculpting it with a spatula. She used a rod to roll the silver sugar out and then formed it into a ball. Using various techniques, she proceeded to mold a sculpture out of the softened silver sugar. The sugar apples entered the stage at which the water they were soaking in would be changed, and they would be boiled down. Anne left the wagon doors open the entire time, and would occasionally jump down from the wagon to stir the pot, scooping out the foam and bits of core. Then she would return to the wagon and resume work on the sugar sculpture. Jonas peeked his head into Anne's wagon periodically. However, without saying a word, he would check on Anne's progress and then leave quietly. Anne found the situation awkward, so she couldn't bring herself to call out to him either. From time to time, she could hear the sound of wolves howling. However, she felt safe inside the walls of the rest stop and didn't really pay attention to them. The sugar apples had broken down and were transferred to a flat stone container where they were spread out evenly. On the second day, Anne continued working on the sugar sculpture almost without rest. She ate while stirring the pot and slept for only 2 or 3 hours. Thanks to this, the sugar sculpture was beginning to take form before her eyes. Following her memory, Anne added minutely detailed workmanship, creating a sculpture identical to the ones Emma had made. The petals of the flowers changed color in a gradation. The wings of the butterflies were perforated in a geometric pattern. The leaves were molded in a gentle curve. The sugar sculpture was large, bigger than the width of Anne's arms. With a sculpture this big, it was difficult to judge the balance of the entire structure. However, Anne handled that marvelously as well. On the morning of the 3rd day of its construction, the sugar sculpture was complete. It was a fine piece of workmanship. Anne would go so far as to say pridefully that as a sugar sculpture, it was perfect. However, Anne wasn't able to shake a strange sense of incongruity. It was identical to the sugar sculptures that Emma had made, and yet, Anne felt that this sculpture was lacking the magnetic force that enchanted anyone who laid eyes on one of Emma's sugar sculptures. Monkey see, monkey do. Those words echoed over and over again inside her head. However, her technique was perfect. She told herself that it would be fine. So that the completed sculpture wouldn't fall over and break, Anne tied a rope around the base. Then she secured the rope to the work table. Like this, even if the wagon was swaying, the sugar sculpture wouldn't fall over and break. With this complete, she breathed a sigh of relief. Anne descended from the wagon on shaky legs, worn out from days of working non-stop. I'm tired. Anne sank down to sit beside Shall, who lay back on the grass looking up at the sky. Is it finished? Shall asked without seeming to be particularly interested. Anne nodded and laid down right where she was on the grass. While looking at the color of the withered autumn grass up close, Anne counted the days. Including today, there are only 2 days left until the festival. This afternoon I-11 grind up the distilled sugar apples that are drying right now and make them into silver sugar. Then, if we leave tomorrow, we'll be able to arrive in Lewiston the day before the festival. I'll be able to present a sugar sculpture and 3 barrels of silver sugar. Thank goodness. A smile overflowed onto Anne's face. The wind blew, rustling through the grass. It's strange, Shall said quietly. What is? When I first saw you in the fairy market, you smelled sweet like silver sugar. I thought that was strange. Really, I must have had some staining my dress. Sniffing loudly, Anne smelled the sleeve of her dress. Shall shook his head. It's your fingers give off a sweet smell. I don't smell anything. I do. I see, well, I'm always handling silver sugar, it's all I know. Anne relaxed for a while, feeling peaceful. Shall's wing was stretched out on the grass right in front of her. Reflecting the light of the sun, it shimmered a light green color. Anne was looking at that shimmering light. Just then, the sound of footsteps approached from the direction of Anne's head. Jonas's kind voice floated down to her. Anne, you did it. I peeked inside the wagon. It's really incredible. I've never seen such a large and finely detailed sugar sculpture. There's no doubt it will win the royal medal. Because she was completely exhausted, Anne didn't even raise her head and simply thanked him. Thank you, Jonas. It was only possible because you knew the location of the sugar apples. No, thank you. Jonas laughed slightly, then walked off in the direction of Anne's wagon. What is he thanking me for? Anne thought it was strange and raised her head. That's when Anne saw Jonas hooking up his own horses to her box-shaped wagon. What are you doing, Jonas? I thought I'd get going. Shall furrowed his brows and sat up. You're too impatient, Jonas. The silver sugar isn't finished yet. We're leaving tomorrow. Besides, those aren't my horses. That's fine, my horses are faster. That should do it. Jonas expressionlessly finished hooking up his horses, then climbed up onto the driver's seat of Anne's wagon. At last Anne realized that he was acting strangely. Standing up, she began to walk towards him. Jonas, what is it? I wouldn't have had to do something like this if you'd only fallen in love with me and agreed to marry me. This is your fault. I confessed to you 3 times, but you rejected me. Just then, the closed iron door of the rest stop burst open forcefully. The person who came flying in was Cassie. She appeared frantic. She was holding a chunk of meat with blood dripping from it. She took many giant leaps, heading towards them as quickly as possible. Behind Cassie, the footsteps of multiple wild beasts could be heard. Shall leapt to his feet, eyes flashing. What is the meaning of this? While yelling this, Shall held out his right hand, summoning his sword. At the same time as the sword appeared, the sound of heavy breathing filled the rest stop. It was a pack of wolves. There were 30 of them. Anne stiffened at the appearance of the wolf pack. Cathy closed in on Anne and yelled in a shrieking voice, I told you not to get so full of yourself. Then she threw the chunk of meat in her hands, and it hit Anne in the chest. At that instant, Cathy took an even larger leap. She leapt up onto the roof of Anne's wagon. Chasing after the chunk of meat, the wolves all turned as one and charged towards Anne. Shall leapt between Anne, who was so stunned she couldn't even let out a shriek, and the wolves. With a single swing of his sword, he cut down 3 of the charging wolves. The wolves halted their charge and, growling, spread out to surround Anne. Shall, what is this? They did this, they lured them in. By them does he mean Jonas and Cassie? Why would they? Jonas applied the whip to the horses. At that noise, Anne's thoughts, which had come to a standstill, began moving again. Then she realized. Jonas intends to steal the sugar sculpture I created. Anne completely forgot that she was surrounded by wolves. Without thinking, she set out at a run. Jonas! Anne chased after the wagon that had already begun moving and jumped up onto the driver's seat. Seated on the driver's seat, Jonas took a large bottle out of the pocket at his chest. He drove out the cork with his thumb and dumped the contents over her head. Anne was sprayed with a thick, reddish-black liquid that reeked of blood. Unperturbed, Anne grasped desperately onto the sleeve of Jonas's jacket. The wolves reacted to the liquid that had been poured over Anne. The wolves! Surrounding Shall once again leapt for Anne. Shall clucked his tongue and slashed at the leaping wolves. But as if driven mad, the wolves continued to charge, their eyes bloodshot. Wait! Bye-bye, Anne. The whip came down, targeting the hand that clutched the sleeve of Jonas's jacket. Hot pain bit into the back of Anne's hand, and she lost her grip on Jonas's sleeve. With her hold on Jonas's sleeve broken, Anne was shaken off of the racing wagon and fell to the ground. The wolves rushed to leap on the fallen Anne. Shall jumped into the fray, sword swinging. Anne screamed at his back as he cut down one attacking wolf after another. Shall, go after Jonas, go, quickly. If one leave, you'll become the wolves' dinner. It's fine, I don't care, go get it back, get my sugar sculpture back. I refuse. Shall never stopped moving, continuously cutting down wolves and sending their blood flying in all directions. A wolf leapt for Shah's wing, which streamed out behind him in accordance with his movements. The beasts were instinctually aware of the fairy's weakness. Just before the wolf's fangs sunk into his wing, Shall jerked his body around and swung his sword. Get it back, go after them, please, please do as I say. Then order me as my owner. I'll tear your wing, I'll destroy your wing. No matter how she tried, Anne couldn't make such atrocious words come out of her mouth. Please go after them. All Anne could do was scream. Shall, go after them, please go after them, please, please. The wagon bearing Anne's sugar sculpture disappeared from sight. Looking at the corpses at his feet of the wolves he'd killed, Shall&Ann came to a halt. As could be expected, he was breathless. His wing was splattered with blood. With a reflexive shudder he flapped his wing, shaking off the blood. The wolves had persistently targeted his wing. He felt the chill of fear shoot up his spine many times. Anne sank to the ground amidst the stench of blood, oblivious. Shall felt a sense of relief that Anne and his wing that she carried were safe. He shook his sword, dismissed it, then approached Anne. Why didn't you go after them? Gazing out of the gate through which the wagon had disappeared, Anne spoke with a blank expression on her face. If I went after Jonas, you would have been eaten by the wolves. I know that. Suddenly Anne stood and walked up to Shall. I know that, but that is what you decided. It wasn't what I wanted. I didn't care if I got eaten by wolves, I just didn't want him to have my sugar sculpture. You won't listen to a single one of my orders. It's been that way ever since we started out on this journey. In the end, you've always acted on your own judgment. Right, you just couldn't leave my side because I had your wing. And earlier, if you'd gone after my sugar sculpture, I might have been eaten by wolves. If that had happened, your wing might have been damaged as well, right? That's why you protected me instead of my sugar sculpture. That's the only reason. I get it, I can't use you. That's why it turned out like this. Screaming this, Anne thumped on Shall's chest with both of her fists with all of her might. She struck him over and over. She continued to hit him until she was completely exhausted and there was no strength left in her arms. Anne's words were frenzied and irrational. She herself must have been aware of that, but perhaps she couldn't help but say them, so Shall let her do as she wished. At last Anne's hands dropped to her sides. Worn out, she made her way on shaky legs to the remaining wagon and went inside. It's true, I've never once listened to her orders. The only reason Shall had saved Anne so many times during this journey was because she was holding his wing. If she were hurt, the wing would be hurt as well. So he had protected her in order to protect his wing. That was all. However, at that time, the instant the wolves leapt for Anne, the thought that his wing might be damaged never entered his mind. His body had moved instantaneously to protect Anne, who stood dumbfounded and unmoving. Something cold and wet dripped onto Shall's cheek. When he looked up, rain was falling from the darkening sky. It looked like someone's tears.